The video you're about to watch is the product of more than 2 years of research, which began when a few of my younger cousins, whom I adore, suggested that I make a video on Canada's most famous lake monster. With the exception of my 2018 book, Legends of the Nahanni Valley, it is the most research-intensive project I've ever completed. The subject of this piece, the legendary monster of Okanagan Lake, has featured in many books, documentaries, and television programs over the years. Instead of recycling material from these pieces, I wanted to do a deep dive into the legend's origins in native tradition and frontier literature, something which no researcher had yet attempted. In the process, I uncovered all sorts of startling information, which inspired my YouTube series on the British Columbia Triangle, and discovered forgotten monsters of native legend, like the Crawler, the Deerman, and the Pethel, which have found their ways into other videos on this channel. The end result is this massive video, which would perhaps be more at home on the pages of a book than on a screen. It has all the elements of what I consider my best books, including extraneous but colorful details concerning life on the Canadian frontier, unhurried sections on history and geography, which place the story in its full context, and forgotten archival material that hasn't seen the light of day for generations. Despite its perhaps being a bit more thorough than is desirable for video format, I am very proud of it, and I hope that you enjoy it. Without further ado, here is Ogopogo, Canada's Loch Ness monster. Enjoy. At the edge of the Highlands, in the heart of the interior, lies a long, narrow lake of astonishing depth. Local legend has it that the cold blue waters of this freshwater fjord are home to an ancient monster with the head of a horse and the body of a serpent. Hundreds of witnesses, local and visiting alike, claim to have seen the creature from their boats or from the safety of the shore. Scientists and adventurers have scoured the waves and plumbed the depths in search of it, but none yet have uncovered indisputable evidence of its existence. Despite the many similarities between the two, the body of water above described is not Loch Ness, the storied lake which bisects the Scottish Highlands, nor its monstrous denizen, the famous Loch Ness monster. The lake in question is in fact Loch Ness's larger, less well-known Canadian sister, Okanagan Lake, which lies in south-central British Columbia at the edge of the Okanagan Highland, and its mysterious serpentine inmate, the legendary Ogopogo. Similar to its Scottish counterpart, the valley surrounding Okanagan Lake is flanked by high hills covered with coniferous forest. Rather than Highland Scotch whiskey, however, the dry, sunny climate which characterizes this Canadian vale allows for the production of fruit and wine, for which the region is nationally renowned. For over 100 years, residents of Kelowna, Vernon, and other cities, towns, and villages skirting the shores of Okanagan Lake have proudly boasted of their backyard monster, their respective communities often vying with each other in local newspapers for recognition as the official home of the Ogopogo. The popular image of the creature as a giant serpent with wavy humps, a horse-like head, and 2 tall horns is ubiquitous in the region, appearing in the form of park sculptures, business logos, and hockey team mascots. Since at least the 1940s, Canadian newspapers have reflected the general Canadian consensus that the tale of the Ogopogo is one of British Columbia's 3 classic monster stories, the other 2 being the legend of the Sasquatch, a race of elusive hairy giants who prowl the mountains of the Pacific Northwest, and the story of Caddy, a sea serpent seen from time to time in Cadborough Bay, on the southern shores of Vancouver Island, at the eastern end of Greater Victoria. Sightings of and encounters with these mysterious creatures have been reported for as long as human beings have bordered their supposed haunts, and as such reports gradually became public knowledge throughout the 20th century, A handful of open-minded, scientifically bent professionals began to treat these legendary monsters as members of some undiscovered animal species, the existence of which has yet to be accepted by the scientific community. Today, the Sasquatch, Caddy, and the Ogopogo are three of Western Canada's most famous cryptids, or hidden animals. Of all the Canadian monster stories I've researched over the years, none have consumed so much of my blood, sweat, and tears, yet yielded such comparatively meager fruit as the legend of the Ogopogo. While I typically try to avoid boring my readers with the often tedious details of the process by which I research my stories, the unique difficulties I've encountered in my attempt to uncover the early story of the monster of Okanagan Lake may hold something in the way of entertainment value for readers with a ruthless sense of humor. The airing of those difficulties will certainly make me feel better about having endured them. The most important reason for the following exposition of my early research into the Ogopogo legend, however, is that it is perhaps the most effective way of illustrating the huge degree to which one extraordinary ethnologist helped form one of Canada's most beloved legends. Like most good Canadian folktales, the legend of the Ogopogo has its roots in the oral traditions of Canada's First Nations, specifically the traditions of the Okanagan Indians, an interior Salish people whose ancestors dug their pit houses and erected their birch bark lodges on the shores of Okanagan Lake for millennia. The pattern which most great Canadian monster stories follow would suggest, and indeed popular Okanagan Valley tradition firmly contends, that the tale of the Ogopogo has been a staple of Okanagan campfire stories for generations. It was to my great astonishment and dismay, therefore, to discover that traditional native references to Canada's most famous lake monster are almost completely non-existent. Precious few of the classic ethnologies on the Okanagan Indians make any mention of a monster in Okanagan Lake. Some texts do make brief allusions to legendary lake monsters in general, and a few refer to specific monsters in neighboring bodies of water, like Nicola Lake, Shuswap Lake, Lake Coeur d'Alene, and the Columbia River. But of the creature in Okanagan Lake, nearly all are perfectly silent. In an effort to obtain some sort of primary information on the Okanagan Indian conception of the Ogopogo, I sent a formal request for information to the Silk Okanagan Nation Alliance in the summer of 2020. Attaching a traditional propitiatory gift of tobacco in the form of 5 very classy Cuban cigars. About 6 months later, I received an email acknowledging receipt of my letter and a pendant gift, and directing me to get in touch with another department. I did as suggested, and have been waiting for a reply ever since. Such taciturnity would seem to suggest that either the Okanagan natives did not and do not consider the Ogopogo an especially important element of their oral heritage, or that they were historically, and remain currently, extremely reluctant to discuss the subject with outsiders. Despite the astounding dearth of verifiable traditional stories on British Columbia's most famous lake monster, there is a sizable body of local folklore, ostensibly born out of casual conversations between local Indians and early 20th century Okanagan pioneers, which hints that the indigenous people of the BC interior have long been aware of an unusual creature that lived in Okanagan Lake, and have always feared and respected it. Since at least 1931, beginning with a poem written by a pioneer named Susan Allison, whose work we will explore later in this piece, some of the magazine and newspaper articles which make up the second-hand ethnological repertoire have contended that the word Naitaka was the name that the Okanagan Indians traditionally applied to the monster of Okanagan Lake. Since at least 1947, beginning with a newspaper article probably written by historian Frank Buckland, whose work we will explore shortly, others have identified Naitaka as a perversion of the Okanagan word Enha-Ha'itk, meaning sacred creature of the water. Most of the stories which comprise this regional folkloric anthology allege that, according to Indian legend, the lair of the Naitaka is an underwater cave which runs beneath the lake bottom. This den is said to lie between Rattlesnake Island, a small isle off the lake's eastern shore, located across the water from present-day Peachland, and a promontory called Squally Point, located about 2 kilometers southwest of the island. When passing this point on foot or in canoes, natives were said to leave offerings of horse meat, venison, berries, or tobacco. It is perhaps worth noting that one rare piece of first-hand frontier ethnology places this monster's supposed lair in a different location, in what is now the vicinity of Allison Provincial Park, on the lake's northeastern shore. The piece in question is a statement made by Okanagan pioneer R. Lecky Ewing, the namesake of Ewing's Landing, which lies opposite the lake from Allison Provincial Park, to the local press in the summer of 1926. Ewing's statement appeared in the August 8, 1926 issue of Vancouver, BC's Sunday Province. My first recollection of the sea-serpent myth, as I considered it then, Ewing said, was 25 years ago. I remember very distinctly that there was a certain portion of the lake, approximately 3 square miles in area, in which the Indians would not fish. In those days, there were many Indians in the Okanagan, and their chief means of support was fishing. The area in which they did not fish, I found, was about 8 miles south of Okanagan Landing, the latter being a natural harbor located a few miles southwest of Vernon. I also discovered that it was an excellent fishing ground, and there I obtained many good bags. Not many of the Indians could speak English, and only a few of them would converse with us white settlers. Finally, however, I had a talk with an old fellow, and asked him why the Indians would not enter that area of water. He replied that they were afraid of a big lake devil. Of all the 20th century folktales purporting to be genuine Okanagan traditions, among the most colorful and most frequently cited is a tale collected by the aforementioned Frank Morgan Buckland, co-founder of the Okanagan Historical Society, and author of the 1948 book Ogopogo's Vigil, A History of Kelowna and District. Author Mary Moon reproduced this tale in her seminal 1977 book, Ogopogo, the Okanagan Mystery, claiming that Buckland heard it from some older Indians. Although Moon neither assigned a date to Buckland's story, nor revealed where she had found it, a slightly different version of the same tale, posthumously attributed to Buckland, which appeared in the 54th report of the Okanagan Historical Society in 1990, gives us a clue as to its age and origin. A footnote beneath this version states, "This story was written about 1927 for the entertainment of Buckland's brothers and sisters." The copyright is assigned to the Kelowna branch of the Okanagan Historical Society by Mrs. Charles Buckland, a daughter-in-law of the author. Sometime in the distant past, the story goes, an Okanagan chief named Timbasket traveled north from his home on the Columbia Plateau to visit some relatives at the site of what is now the district of Westbank in West Kelowna, on the western shores of Okanagan Lake. At that time, Chief Timbasket's hosts were planning to attend the annual Okanagan Rendezvous at the lake's southern tip, where Okanagan bands from across the country gathered together every summer. In order to protect his fellow tribesmen from the wrath of the lake spirit and ensure their safe passage through his waters, the band's medicine man inscribed the bows of their pine bark canoes with a special symbol, using a mixture of red earth, yellow ochre, and precious Eulachon fish oil as paint. Before their departure, the shaman provided the travelers with a live dog, which he instructed them to throw into the water as a sacrifice to Enhahaet when they neared Squally Point, and advised them to steer clear of the area as they paddled past. Chief Timbasket was a skeptic at heart, who scoffed at the notion of a monster in Okanagan Lake. When the party neared Squally Point, giving the lair of the Enhahaet a wide berth as they prepared to sacrifice the dog the medicine man had given them, Timbasket boldly paddled alongside the haunted headland. Suddenly, Buckland's informants told him, the lake demon arose from its lair and whipped the surface of the lake with its long tail. Timbasket, his family, and his canoe were sucked under by a great swirl of angry water. In the version of the story published in 1990, Buckland declared that the great swirl of angry water was the product of a stiff gale, produced by the lashing of the lake demon's tail. In a third version of the story, published in the July 16, 1955 issue of Vancouver, BC's The Province, Author Glenn McDougall stated that the lake monster smashed Timbasket's canoe with its tail directly, before dragging the unfortunate chief beneath the waves. Years later, Buckland continued in the piece cited by Mary Moon. A hunting party stalking deer high up on the same shore found a wrecked canoe, splintered and rotting. 2 daubs of yellow ochre on its shattered bow identified it as the property of the vanished Timbasket. How did it get there, so high up on the mountain, the legend asks, for its position was far beyond the reach of any wave in the lake. Had the lake demon dragged the canoe and the Timbasket family halfway up the slope before devouring them? In the version published in 1990, Buckland identified the final terrestrial resting place of Timbasket's canoe as the shores of a small pond known as Medicine Lake, located above the Big Canyon. Considering the context of the story, it seems possible that Medicine Lake may be an antiquated name for Baker Lake, which lies about 4.5 miles east of Squally Point, and about 3 miles east of Wild Horse Canyon, the latter perhaps being Buckland's Big Canyon. It is certainly possible that the tale of Chief Timbasket is based on a real Okanagan oral tradition, which Buckland learned from some older Indians while growing up in Kelowna in the early 1900s, as Mary Moon contended. Nevertheless, given the vague third-hand nature of Moon's attribution, and the statement in the 1990 publication that Buckland wrote the piece for the enjoyment of his siblings, we cannot consider it an undeniably genuine Okanagan legend. To obtain verifiable traditional stories on the monster in Okanagan Lake, we must turn to what scanty information can be gleaned from classic Okanagan ethnologies. According to Volume 12 of the Handbook of North American Indians, which treats of the First Nations of British Columbia's interior plateau, and the Native Americans of its U.S. counterpart, the Columbia Plateau, the most comprehensive ethnographic source on the Okanagan are the writings of James Alexander Tate, a Scots-Canadian anthropologist who lived among the natives of the British Columbian interior throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In his piece on Okanagan history and culture, in the 45th Annual Report of the Bureau of American Ethnology, Tate wrote that the Okanagan traditionally believed in land and water mysteries, strange phenomena which he described more extensively in other writings. From the Kootenay Rockies of southeastern British Columbia to the upper Fraser Valley far to the west, interior and central Coast Salish tribes believed that particular lakes and mountain peaks are imbued with ancient preternatural power. Legend has it that these locations are inhabited by evil spirits, perhaps the ghosts of long-dead medicine men, who curse those who trespass on their haunts. Anyone who dares to visit one of these sacred sites is in danger of seeing some sort of bizarre apparition, which is believed to be either a hallucination produced by the power inherent to the land and water, or a visual manifestation of the spirit whose presence gives the place its sinister character. Those who see such apparitions often become sick or die shortly afterward. The Thompson Indians, whose territory lies west of Okanagan country, described their own water mysteries as taking various forms, such as human beings, grizzly bears, and fish of peculiar shape. Thompson elder Annie York, according to historian Andrea Laforet in her 1999 book, From Spasm, Fraser Canyon Histories, 1808 to 1839, claimed that an Indian girl once saw a water mystery in Nicola Lake, which appeared in the form of a giant eel. The experience left her paralyzed. East of Thompson Territory, in the upper reaches of the Fraser Valley, lies the land of the Stalo, or upriver Hulkamalum, a collection of central Coast Salish nations, whose members also believed in land and water mysteries. They called the malicious denizens of these dangerous locales Slalakum, a word which they used to denote any unusual creature, and claimed that the water-dwelling variety typically appeared as giant snakes, long double-headed serpents, or aquatic bears. Irish-Canadian painter Paul Kane alluded to the latter monster in his 1858 travel memoir, Travels and Adventures Among the Indians of North America, writing that the Chinook natives of Washington and Oregon's Columbia River referred to them as skookums, and described them as a strange type of fish which had heads like bears. The Shuswap Indians, who lived north of Okanagan country, said that the water mysteries in their own territory often appeared as creatures that were half human and half fish. They cause storms on lakes, Tate wrote, swamp canoes, and make rainfall when people fish. Geologist George Mercer Dawson elaborated on these malevolent beings in his 1891 Notes on the Shuswap People of British Columbia, writing that they were said to inhabit nearly all the large lakes in British Columbia, specifically mentioning Shuswap Lake, Kamloops Lake, and Adams Lake. They are said to have been about twice the size of ordinary human beings, he wrote, with human heads, long hair, and tails like fish. Dawson's informants told him that the water mysteries in Adams Lake, a long and narrow body of water northeast of the city of Kamloops, just west of Shuswap Lake, dwelled in an underwater cave at the foot of a cliff which overlooks the lake's eastern end. Indians were afraid to pass this point in canoes, he wrote, as when doing so, the winds frequently arose in consequence of the malign power of the water people, and canoes were swamped and occupants drowned. A remarkably similar tradition regarding a particular cliff overlooking the southern shores of Nicola Lake appears in both James Tate's Ethnology on the Thompsons and archaeologist Keo Borson's contribution to Volume 12 of the Handbook of North American Indians. The rocky face of this mysterious escarpment was once inscribed with blood-red pictographs, painted in red ochre, which the local Nicola Indians, according to Borson, believed were created long ago by dangerous spirits. The Indians, while passing below in canoes, wrote Tate of this ominous lakeside landmark, avoid looking at the place, because if they do so, they say the wind will immediately commence to blow. Considered as a whole, the various interior sailors' traditions regarding Lakes Adams and Nicola strongly suggest a traditional association between water mysteries, ancient rock art, and sudden violent wind, a triad which, as we shall soon learn, features in the legend of the Ogopogo. Dawson, as we have seen, explicitly described a connection between water mysteries and violent wind, and both Tate and Borson an association between violent wind and ancient pictographs. Tate cemented the connection between mysterious rock paintings and land and water mysteries in a 1918 letter to Francis Kermode, the first curator of the Royal British Columbia Museum in Victoria, BC, and the namesake of the famous Kermode, or spirit bear, of the Pacific Northwest. Tate wrote that the Thompson Indians of the Stein River Valley, west of the Fraser Canyon, regarded the lonely alcoves adorned with ancient pictographs, which could be found here and there throughout their territory, as the haunts of mysteries. The mysterious forces or powers of nature were believed to be in greater abundance and strength at these places. The shores of Okanagan Lake have several mysterious pictographs of their own, many of which have since eroded into oblivion. A granite shelf overlooking McKinley Landing, for example, the latter being a stretch of shore located on the lake's eastern side, about 4 kilometers north of Kelowna, once bore 2 mysterious red ochre paintings, which are said to have faded completely sometime in the late 1960s. According to Mary Moon, Kelowna-based historian Primrose Upton, the author of the 1958 book, The History of the Okanagan Mission, a Centennial Retrospect, observed this ancient artwork before its erosion, and sketched it for posterity. Upton is said to have described the lower piece as a depiction of a horned creature, with the head of a horse, a forked tail, and a single hump on its back. The upper piece, Upton claimed, portrayed the same creature stealing away through the weeds, in a manner suggestive of a very large rodent. Although Upton made no mention of these specific paintings in her 1958 history of the Okanagan Mission, her book's 5th page contains a simple drawing evoking her supposed sketch of the lower painting at McKinley Landing. This image, which was inserted into the upper left-hand corner of the text in the manner of a historiated initial, depicts the side profile of a horse-like head with horns, perched upon a serpentine neck. On the opposite side of the lake from McKinley Landing, near the headwaters of a stream called Powers Creek, which runs through West Kelowna, another red ochre painting of a mysterious creature is said to have once been emblazoned on a huge rock. Frank Buckland characterized this particular pictograph as tangible evidence that the Indians believed in and worshipped some lake demon. Amateur archaeologist John Corner, whom Keel Borson cited as an authority on Okanagan Lake pictographs, included the Powers Creek painting in his 1968 book, Pictographs, Indian Rock Paintings in the Interior of British Columbia. Corner explained that Powers Creek was actually home to 3 pictographs, all of which were painted near a series of caves in the shoreline rock. One painting depicting an eagle or hawk stood alone near the mouth of one of the caves, while the other 2 adorned a large granite block about 50 yards to the southwest. Corner identified one of the paintings which comprised the latter pair as a depiction of the sun, but offered no opinion as to the nature of its companion. If Corner's interpretation is accurate, we must assume that this second painting is Buckland's Lake Demon. In his book's introduction, John Corner alluded to 2 more legendary Indian paintings of the Okanagan Lake monster, both of which he was personally unable to locate. One of these is said to have once adorned a rock face on the eastern side of the lake, near Squally Point, the site of the Ogopogo's legendary underwater cave. An article in the October 1925 issue of the Winnipeg Evening Tribune contended that this painting depicts natives carrying conciliatory baskets of berries and venison to the monster's lair. Another record, Corner wrote, describes a tremendously large painting of the lake demon on the sheer side of a mountain peak. This is supposed to be the inland lair of the demon. No white man has ever seen it, although it is supposed to be located 15 to 20 miles back in the hills from Kelowna. John Corner illustrated and described 7 more Okanagan Lake pictographs in his book, 3 of them located on an old fur trade trail on the lake's western shore, and the other 4 adorning an old Indian trail on the eastern side of the lake. The amateur archaeologist conservatively withheld his own analyses of many of the pictographs in his book, stating that, while explanations and interpretations have been freely given for many contemporary amateur of archaeology, clear evidence of origin, age, and meaning is woefully inadequate. Nevertheless, drawing from a chart displaying James Tate's interpretations of various interior Salish pictographs found throughout the interior plateau, Corner added some sparing commentary to the more obvious designs. He identified a strange animal painted on a cliff east of Squally Point, which some might be tempted to classify as a depiction of the Okanagan Lake monster, as a rendering of a horse hitched to a travois. He interpreted the 2 strange figures to the left of the horse, however, as armless and legless anthropomorphic torsos encircled by finger dots, a design which he considered very unusual. These armless and legless figures, incidentally, evoke a certain alpine monster of interior sailors' tradition, which Tate detailed in his treatise on the Thompson Indians. Tate described this sinister creature as a human body of a white color, without any limbs, which constantly rolls over the ground uttering cries like an infant. A person who sees this monster will die shortly afterward. The Thompson, the Shuswap, and, bizarrely, the distant and unrelated Talton of northwestern British Columbia, all told strikingly similar stories about a water mystery or water being who seduced a married native woman long ago. In nearly every version of the story, the woman's husband discovered the secret affair and dealt both his wife and her lover gruesome punishments, the details of which this author considers too lurid to recount in this piece. In her 1933 book, Coyote Tales, American Okanagan native Christine Quintasket, better known by her pen name Morning Dove, included a less horrific Okanagan variation of this legend, which almost certainly has some connection with the legendary monster of Okanagan Lake. In order to appreciate one reason for this potential connection, some geographic knowledge of Okanagan country is required. Okanagan Lake, as previously mentioned, is a long, narrow body of water which runs down the length of British Columbia's southern interior. The lake has a length of 135 kilometers, or 84 miles, and is speculated to be as deep as 232 meters, or 761 feet. Today, the region immediately north of the lake, called the Northern Okanagan, is home to a scattering of tiny towns and cities, including Enderby, Glenema, Armstrong, and Grindrod. The city of Vernon lies near the lake's northeastern end. On the eastern shores of the lake's longitudinal center sits Kelowna, the largest city in the Okanagan, and the third largest metropolitan area in the province, after Vancouver and Victoria. Across the lake from Kelowna is the much smaller city of West Kelowna. Further down the valley, on the lake's western shore, lies the tiny community of Peachland, and about 20 minutes south of Peachland is the town of Summerland. The city of Penticton sits at the lake's southern tip. The southern end of Okanagan Lake drains into the Okanagan River, a south-flowing waterway, which widens into Little Skaha Lake about 5 kilometers downstream, into tiny Vasseau Lake, another 5 kilometers beyond Skaha, and again into the larger Osoyoos Lake, which sits directly on the border separating the province of British Columbia from the American state of Washington. The city of Oliver lies roughly halfway between Lake Skaha and Osoyoos, while the city of Osoyoos hugs the western shores of the lake for which it was named, just north of the border. The Okanagan River continues south over Washington's semi-arid Columbia Plateau for over 100 kilometers, or more than 60 miles, before draining into the Columbia River at what is now the city of Brewster, Washington. The Okanagan River thus directly connects Okanagan Lake with the Columbia River, presumably allowing any hypothetical water monster capable of negotiating the now-vanished Okanagan Falls, a shallow drop which once lay south of Skaha Lake, to freely travel between them. As a tongue-in-cheek article in the September 5, 1926 issue of the Vancouver Sunday Province put it, a glance at the map will convince all who wish to be convinced that it is easy for the sea-serpent to make this journey of 2,000 miles, owing for detours. The Okanagan River, which flows from the south end of the lake through Dog Lake and Osoyoos Lake, takes the traveler to the Columbia River, and so to the open ocean near Astoria, Oregon. Now that we have a better understanding of the connection between the Columbia River and Okanagan Lake, let us return to Mourning Dove's 1933 book, Coyote Tales. In her book, Mourning Dove included an old Okanagan tale, which she entitled Fox and Coyote and Whale. According to this story, Fox and his brother Coyote once lived along the shores of the Columbia River upriver from Kettle Falls, a series of rapids and cascades which lie far upriver from the mouth of the Okanagan, and about 130 kilometers or 80 miles southeast of Okanagan Lake, as the crow flies. Fox had a beautiful wife, whom he loved very much, but whom failed to requite his devotion. Every day, while he was out hunting, she sat on the shores of the Columbia River and sang love songs to the water. Fox's brother, Coyote, observed this questionable behavior and suspected that his sister-in-law was in love with someone other than her husband. He shared his suspicion with Fox, but his brother, blinded by conjugal infatuation, would not hear a word of it. One day, Fox and Coyote went on a hunting trip together. When they returned home, Fox's wife was nowhere to be seen. Remembering what his brother had told him, Fox trotted down the banks of the Columbia River. Soon he came upon his wife, who was sitting at the river's edge, singing a love song just as Coyote said she was wont to do. Concealing himself behind some brush, he waited to see what would happen. As Fox watched, Mourning Dove wrote, the water began to rise. Slowly it rose, higher and higher, and soon out of the middle of the river appeared a big monster of the fish kind. The monster was Enha-etk, the spirit of the water, whale. The monster came ashore and threw off his cetaceous cloak, transforming himself into a tall, handsome man with long braided hair. Fox's heart sank when the monster man embraced his wife, who passionately reciprocated his affections. Coyote's misgivings were true. Sick at heart, Fox returned home alone, leaving his wife in the arms of her aquatic paramour. She made no appearance at the lodge that night, and Fox gloomily assumed that the water monster had taken her away to his own camp. In spite of her betrayal, Fox still loved his wife, and pined for her return. Several days later, Fox and Coyote heard the sound of distant singing to the south. Peering out of their lodge, they saw two water maidens approaching from downriver, gliding over the water in a strange-looking canoe. The mermaids rocked back and forth in their craft, singing a song which indicated that they came to steal food for Fox's wife, as the fare served in the house of the water monster did not agree with her. Fox and Coyote hid in their lodge and accosted the water maidens when they walked through the entrance. After some fierce interrogation, the nymphs broke down and told the brothers that Fox's wife could be found underwater at the southern terminus of Kettle Falls, warning them that the water monster would kill them if they trespassed on his domain. When they had gleaned all the information they could from the two servants, Fox and Coyote broke their necks and removed their watery robes, which they threw around their own shoulders in order to disguise themselves. After packing some dried meat and berries, they climbed aboard the maiden's strange craft and headed downriver, piloting the canoe by rocking back and forth as the mermaids had done. They plunged over Kettle Falls and, through the magic of the strange canoe, found themselves in the camp of the water people. Fooled by their mermaid disguises, notwithstanding the giggles of a nearby mouse who saw through the deception, the water people ushered Fox and Coyote to the lodge of the water monster. Inside, the brothers found Whaleman sitting beside Fox's stolen bride, to whom they presented the meat and berries. The monster thanked the impostors for their service, and invited them to take their places at the edge of his lodge. That night, while the camp was asleep, Fox and Coyote quietly arose from their furs. While Coyote scooped up Fox's sleeping wife, Fox crept over to the water monster and beheaded him with a flint knife, keeping the head as a trophy. The commotion roused the whole camp, forcing the trio to make a hasty escape to the surface of the water in the mermaid's magic canoe. When the three land dwellers were safely ashore, Fox grabbed the water monster's head by its long braids and tossed it as hard as he could towards the setting sun, declaring as he did so that whale monsters would ever after abide in the big salt water to the west, no longer lurking in lakes and rivers where they could lure wives from their husbands. A remarkably similar Okanagan legend indicates that Fox might not have thrown the whale monster's head quite far enough if his aim was to confine its ilk to the Pacific Ocean. Sometime prior to her death in 1950, Canadian Okanagan elder Josephine Shuttleworth told a number of traditional Okanagan stories to folklorist and journalist Isabel Christie McNaughton. McNaughton subsequently had the stories published in the Oliver Chronicle, a newspaper based out of Oliver, BC. One of her stories, entitled How the Spider-Woman Was Rescued from the Fishman, contends that Fisher, Martin, Spider-Woman, and Spider-Woman's child once lived together in a lodge on the shores of Okanagan Lake. Every day, Fisher and Martin went out hunting, leaving Spider-Woman and her child alone at home. Every day before departing, the hunters cautioned Spider-Woman against swimming in the lake. But the lake, said Shuttleworth, which was the Okanagan, and as blue and inviting on warm summer days then as it is now, was too much of a temptation. One day, heedless of the hunters' warnings, Spider-Woman decided to go for a swim, tying a rope around her child's waist and securing the other end to a tree so that it could not crawl away. Her preparations complete, she waded out into the lake. She had hardly swum out beyond her depth, Shuttleworth said, when something caught her and took her away. It was the whale man, the monster of the lake. He lived somewhere down under the waters and rocks, in a great cavern where he kept many wives and servants. The whale man took the Spider-Woman to his home. Later that day, Fisher and Martin returned from their hunting trip and were alarmed to find that Spider-Woman was missing. Suspecting the worst, they went down to the lake and found Spider-Woman's child bawling at the foot of the tree where its mother had left it. After cleverly pacifying the little arachnid with makeshift amusements, the hunters set out in search of their missing friend. Fisher and Martin walked along the lakeshore until they came to what is known today as Rocky Point, a barren bluff which juts out over the lake's eastern shore at the northwestern edge of what is now the city of Kelowna. The place, Shuttleworth said, was the entrance to the home of the Whale Man. The hunters hid themselves in the brush and waited, watching the cave's entrance for any sign of activity. After some time had elapsed, two of the Whale Man's fishy servants, the lake chub and the catfish, approached Rocky Point in their canoes, apparently fishing for salmon. Like the water maidens in Morning Dove's story, they rocked to and fro as they progressed over the water, chanting "Ma-go-o, ma-go-o." Fisher and Martin emerged from their hiding places and asked the two fish if they knew what had become of Spider-Woman. Chub and Catfish related her abduction by the Whale Man and agreed to help the hunters rescue her, giving them their robes so that they could disguise themselves as servants, and telling them that it was the Whale Man's custom to send his captives out for a walk at midnight. After conducting a successful reconnaissance mission in the clothes of the fish servants, Fisher and Martin positioned themselves on either side of the cavern, posing as guards. In taking up their positions, the land animals clumsily splashed around more than any self-respecting fish would allow themselves to, betraying their true identities to a nearby mouse. When midnight came, one of the Whale Man's retainers brought Spider-Woman out of the cavern and asked the imposters to take her out for a stroll. Fisher and Martin did as requested. As soon as they were out of earshot, they revealed their true identities to the hapless captive. They then instructed their friend to return to the cave and tickle the Whale Man until he fell asleep. Spider-Woman did as instructed, and before long, the Whale Man was snoring soundly. At a prearranged signal, Fisher and Martin slipped into the cavern and beheaded the sleeping kidnapper. As in Morning Dove's story, the commotion awakened the monster's entourage, prompting the three friends to flee in their canoe, with the creature's head in tow. When they reached the center of the lake, the Whale Man's head suddenly became very heavy. Left with no other choice, Martin reluctantly threw the trophy overboard. The monster's head sank to the bottom of the lake, where it has remained ever since. Josephine Shuttleworth's story is one of only two first-hand Okanagan Indian oral traditions of which this author is aware, which hint at the existence of a monster in Okanagan Lake. The other is a brief passage, which appears in an article entitled "Food and Medicines of the Okanagans," told by Okanagan elder Louise Gabriel to historian Hester E. White, and published in 1954 in the 18th report of the Okanagan Historical Society. According to Gabriel, a great Okanagan chief called Halkawanchin lived on the shores of Okanagan Lake 6 generations prior to the time at which she told her story. In other words, perhaps in the 1770s. He was renowned throughout the region for his generosity, and when a band of Yakima Indians traveled north from their haunts on the Columbia Plateau to seek his assistance during a particularly severe famine, he provided them with enough meat and berries to alleviate their starvation. Out of gratitude, the Yakimas carved a massive dugout canoe and presented it to the Okanagan chief. This vessel measured 18 feet in length and 5 feet in width, making it, according to Gabriel, the largest canoe to ever glide over Okanagan Lake. At each end, Gabriel said, was a huge carving of Naha-Ha'itk, the water god. The chief was very pleased with this gift, so he invited the Yakimas to stay all winter and on into the next summer for hunting and berry picking. For most good Canadian monster stories, such as tales of the Wendigo, or the various wild men of the subarctic, the most interesting sources after native legends are typically the journals, letters, and memoirs of the white fur traders who plied their trade in the Canadian wilderness during the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. The first white men to set foot on the shores of Okanagan Lake were members of the Pacific Fur Company, a short-lived American fur trading syndicate with an epic and tragic history, a brief summary of which may assist in putting the story of the Ogopogo into its historical context. The Pacific Fur Company was founded in 1810 by John Jacob Astor, a German-American businessman based out of New York, who made his fortune buying furs from the Great Lakes, and selling them at profit in London. At that time, rival fur trading syndicates across North America were extending their enterprises into the western half of the continent, into wild countries populated almost exclusively by native tribes. Since the 1770s, the Great English Hudson's Bay Company, or HBC, had been creeping northwest from its traditional haunts on the shores of the frozen sea for which it was named. On the Pacific coast, small independent American traders vied with the Tsar-sponsored Russian-American Company for sea otter pelts, which were purchased from the coastal natives, shipped west across the ocean, and exchanged for Chinese goods like porcelain and tea at Russian ports. And Astor's main competitor, the Northwest Company, or NWC, had already launched 3 exploratory expeditions west across the Rocky Mountains for the purpose of opening up trade with the natives of what is now the British Columbian interior. In 1793, one of the NWC's agents, Sir Alexander Mackenzie, became the first white man to traverse the Great Divide, traveling up the Peace River Valley in what is now west-central Alberta, before continuing west to the Pacific Ocean. A second Nor'wester, as NWC agents were known, named Simon Fraser, repeated Mackenzie's crossing in 1808 and began to establish trading posts throughout what he dubbed New Caledonia, a territory encompassing the northern half of what is now British Columbia. The following year, Nor'wester David Thompson crossed the Rockies further to the south, entering the BC interior by way of the House Pass, east of present-day Red Deer, Alberta. Astor hoped to gain control of what appeared to be the last untapped fur-bearing region on the continent, the watershed of the Columbia River, which flows southwest from the Canadian Rockies, along the border of what are now the American states of Washington and Oregon, before emptying into the Pacific Ocean. To effect this end, he outfitted 2 expeditions with trade goods, and dispatched them to the mouth of the Columbia, one by land and the other by sea. Celebrated American writer Washington Irving, whom Astor commissioned with writing a history of his ill-fated company, succinctly summarized the fate of these ventures in his 1936 book, Astoria, writing, "A strange fatality seems to have attended all the expeditions by sea, nor were those by land much less disastrous. To be more specific, the expedition by sea, conducted in a ship called the Tonquin, successfully carried its human and material cargo from New York all the way down the Atlantic coast, around Cape Horn, and up the Pacific Ocean to the mouth of the Columbia, stopping along the way at Hawaii, or the Sandwich Islands as they were known at the time, to take on fresh water, provisions, and recruits. After establishing the company's headquarters, dubbed Fort Astoria, at the site of what is now the city of Astoria, Washington, a portion of the Tonquin's crew sailed north to Clayoquot Sound, on the west coast of Vancouver Island, for the purpose of trading with the local Nootka Indians. When the ship's petulant captain insulted a Nootkan elder, native warriors surreptitiously overwhelmed and massacred the ship's crew, one member of which, in a desperate act of revenge, set fire to the gunpowder supply in the ship's cargo hold, while the Nootka were still on board, blowing the Tonquin to matchwood. While the dramas of Fort Astoria and the Tonquin were unfolding on the west coast, Astor's land expedition made its way west across the continent, following the general route of the 1804 to 1806 Lewis and Clark expedition. Led by an American trader named Wilson Price Hunt, this so-called overland expedition traveled up the Missouri River and across the Rocky Mountains, surviving several near-disastrous encounters with hostile Sioux warriors, and nearly succumbing to thirst and hunger along the way. Most of the weary and emaciated veterans of the overland expedition finally arrived at Fort Astoria in January 1812, the remainder having either separated from the main party, perished from privation or drowning on the trail, or disappeared in the bush. By the summer of 1811, the tattered survivors of the original nautical expedition had established a palisaded fort at the mouth of the Columbia, and developed a shaky trading relationship with the local Chinook natives. On the advice of 2 mysterious visitors, a pair of medicine women from the distant Kootenai Rockies, who affected the dress and accoutrements of men, a handful of Astorians, as the company's employees called themselves, traveled up the Columbia River and set about constructing a trading post called Fort Okanagan, near the confluence of the Columbia and Okanagan rivers, just east of what is now Brewster, Washington. Leaving a Scotsman named Alexander Ross to single-handedly finish building the fort himself, the remainder of the crew, led by another Scotsman named David Stewart, proceeded up the Okanagan River on an exploratory expedition in the fall of 1811. According to Ross in his 1849 memoir, Stewart and his companions followed the Okanagan River north to its source, Okanagan Lake, becoming the first white men to set foot on the lake's shore. From there, they continued north up the lake, along an ancient grease trail or trading route used by the natives for generations, and proceeded northwest overland to the South Thompson River, where they encountered Shuswap Indians. Due to thick snow, which made travel all but impossible, Stewart and company decided to spend the winter with the Shuswaps. During his stay, Stewart found that the country was rich in beaver and other fur-bearing animals, and resolved to establish a trading post in the area the following year. He made good on his resolution in the summer of 1812, establishing Fort Kamloops at the confluence of the Thompson and South Thompson rivers, at the site of present-day Kamloops, British Columbia. Thereafter, for the next 36 years, fur traders made regular trips between Fort Kamloops and southerly Fort Okanagan, riding on horseback, or tramping on snowshoe up and down what became known as the Okanagan Trail. Despite that, this well-traveled thoroughfare ran through the Okanagan Valley, typically but not exclusively meandering along the western shores of Okanagan Lake. None of the many fur traders who mention the route in their journals and memoirs, including Ross Cox, John Work, John Todd, and Alexander Caulfield Anderson, made any allusion to a monster which haunted the adjoining water. Even the aforementioned Alexander Ross, who married an Okanagan woman, and included special subchapters on various native beliefs and customs throughout his first memoir, failed to so much as hint at the supposed existence of an unusual inhabitant of Okanagan Lake. The Pacific Fur Company came to a sticky end in 1813, due chiefly to a succession of crippling disasters which overtook supply ships bound for Astoria, and the outbreak of the War of 1812. As Alexander Ross put it in the introduction to his second memoir, The Fur Hunters of the Far West, published in 1850, misfortunes alone, over which man had no control, sealed the doom of the unfortunate Astoria. The first ship, called the Tonquin, employed by the Astor Company, was cut off by Indians on the northwest coast, and every soul on board massacred. The second, named the Beaver, was lost in unknown seas, and the third, called the Lark, was upset in a gale 250 miles from the Sandwich Islands, and became a total wreck. And to complete the catalogue of disasters, in 1812, war broke out between England and the United States. Left with little choice, the agents of the Pacific Fur Company sold their assets to their chief rival, the Northwest Company, and abandoned the country, some returning overland to easterly civilization, and others gaining employment in the NWC. Astorian outposts throughout the present-day state of Washington and the province of British Columbia became the property of the Northwest Company, and Fort Astoria itself was occupied by the NWC and renamed Fort George. Forts Okanagan and Kamloops and the adjoining Okanagan Trail were among the many assets which fell into the hands of the Northwest Company following the PFC's dissolution. The Northwest Company made good use of the Okanagan Trail, employing it as an express and supply route, bridging the northern territory of New Caledonia with the southerly Columbia District. The Hudson's Bay Company, which absorbed the Northwest Company in 1821, elevated the trail to a major brigade route in 1826, annually transporting huge loads of furs from New Caledonia down its length on horseback. Upon arriving at Fort Okanagan, the furs were loaded onto flat-bottomed boats called bateaux and carried down the Columbia River to Fort Vancouver, the company's Pacific headquarters, where they were prepared for shipment to London, England. The Okanagan Trail served this function until 1847, a year after British Canada and the United States formally resolved the so-called Oregon Question, designating the 49th parallel the official border between their two territories, all the way from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific coast, and necessitating the HBC's withdrawal from what is now the state of Washington. No sooner had the HBC Fur Brigade hauled its final load down the Okanagan Trail than gold was discovered in the foothills of California's Sierra Nevada. Throughout 1848 and 1849, about 300,000 hopeful prospectors flocked to the Golden State in what is known as the California Gold Rush, touching off a 50-year succession of ever-northerly stampedes which would culminate in the Klondike Gold Rush of 1897-98. The next chapter in the story of Okanagan country, a basic understanding of which is necessary to contextualize the Ogopogo's transition from an obscure native legend to one of Canada's best-known monsters, is inextricably intertwined with the North American prospecting expeditions which punctuated the 19th century. It is interesting to note that, while the event had little influence on the course of Okanagan history, a small amount of gold was discovered in Okanagan Valley in 1833, a full 15 years before the Sierra Nevada first revealed its auric secrets to California's so-called 49ers. That year, Scottish botanist David Douglas, the namesake of the Douglas fir, is said to have found enough gold to make a signet ring on the shores of Okanagan Lake. Throughout the early 1850s, a series of minor gold rushes took place on the Yakima, Pend Oreille, Coeur d'Alene, and Columbia rivers in what is now the state of Washington, drawing veterans of the California gold rush north onto the Columbia Plateau. When news of a gold strike near the confluence of the Fraser and Thompson rivers, not far from present-day Lytton, BC, reached public ears in 1857, many of these American miners resolved to take their chances in what would come to be known as the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush. Most participants in the Fraser Canyon Rush made their ways to the diggings the legal way, by heading to the town of Victoria on Vancouver Island, taking steamers across the Strait of Georgia to the town of New Westminster at the mouth of the Fraser River, heading up the lower Fraser, and either ascending the rugged and dangerous Fraser Canyon itself, or taking an old Hudson's Bay Company trail through the Lillooet Mountains to the canyon's head. Thousands of patriotic Americans, on the other hand, many of them veterans of the California and Columbia Plateau rushes, decided to take illicit, all-American routes to the Fraser Canyon goldfields. Some entered British territory via the so-called Whatcom Trail, traveling overland from Puget Sound, on the coast of what is now northwestern Washington, along the northern feet of the Cascade Mountains, to the mouth of the canyon. Others, encouraged by a guidebook written by the aforementioned fur trader and explorer Alexander Caulfield Anderson, followed the old Astorian route up the Columbia River to Fort Okanagan, through what was then the territory of hostile Yakima and Okanagan Indians, north up the Okanagan Trail, and west down the Thompson River to its confluence with the Fraser. Most primary accounts of American prospectors who traveled to the Fraser Canyon diggings by way of the Okanagan Trail are filled with harrowing stories of skirmishes with hostile natives, who, though friendly to white Hudson's Bay Company employees, resented the influx of so-called Bostons or Americans into their hunting grounds, and violently resisted their encroachments at every turn. As might be expected, none of these primary accounts, of which this author is aware, make any mention of a monster in Okanagan Lake. Although Okanagan natives had lived in seasonal villages throughout the area for generations, the first two permanent white settlements in Okanagan country were established near the end of the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush. The first of these was the city of Kelowna, which began as a nameless Roman Catholic chapel, colloquially referred to as Father Pandozzi's Mission. The church was founded in 1860 by three oblate missionaries, Father Charles Pandozzi, Father Pierre Richard, and Brother Sorel, who had traveled to the Okanagan the previous year. Father Pandozzi, with whom the mission church is most strongly associated today, was a French priest who had cut his pastoral teeth in the Columbia Plateau, serving at various missions throughout the 1840s and 50s, in the midst of violent conflicts called the Cayuse and Yakima Wars, respectively, fought between local native alliances and the U.S. Army. While the three oblate missionaries were busy erecting their log church and rectory on the shores of what would come to be known as Mission Creek, another building was being constructed near the Okanagan Valley, about 50 miles to the southwest, and about 12 miles west of present-day Oliver, BC. In the summer of 1860, on the orders of the Hudson's Bay Company, a short, stocky French Okanagan Métis named François Duchouquet, the factor of Fort Okanagan, moved all the goods from his old post by packhorse to a place on the Similkameen River, which the Indians called Corremios, the Similkameen being a tributary of the Okanagan River, whose headwaters lie in the Cascade Mountains, about 45 kilometers or 28 miles southeast of the mouth of the Fraser Canyon. No longer able to purchase furs from Indians in American territory, Duchouquet was tasked with building a new post at the eastern terminus of the Hope-Similkameen Trail, a rough HBC path which stretched from Fort Hope, a trading post situated at the mouth of the Fraser Canyon, to the Similkameen River, connecting the Fraser and Okanagan valleys. The HPC had good reason to set up shop in this location, doubtless aware that the old Hope Similkameen Trail was scheduled to be supplanted by a more passable thoroughfare. After learning of the existence of an American mining camp called Rock Creek, located in British territory east of Okanagan Lake, Sir James Douglas, governor of the newly established colony of British Columbia, decided to commission the construction of a road between Fort Hope and the easterly diggings. He appointed this task to a surveyor and civil engineer named Edgar Dewdney, an Englishman who would one day become the lieutenant governor of British Columbia, and named the road he blazed the Dewdney Trail in his honor. While Duchosquet was felling trees and stripping bark under the sweltering glare of the Similkameen sun, another pioneer who would later settle the Okanagan Valley was panning for gold further upriver. John Fall Allison was an English-American immigrant and veteran of the California Rush, who followed the lure of the yellow metal to the Fraser Canyon. In the summer of 1860, at the behest of Governor Douglas, Allison led a prospecting expedition down the Similkameen River. During this excursion, he became so enamored with the country that, in the spring of 1861, he returned to the Similkameen to establish his own farm and ranch. He decided to make his home at the confluence of the Similkameen and the northerly Tulameen River, a place which the natives called Vermilion Forks, on account of a rich deposit of red ochre which lay nearby. Allison's ranch was the seed of what would one day become the town of Princeton, BC. In 1868, John Allison married Edgar Dewdney's sister-in-law, a 23-year-old Englishwoman named Susan Louisa Moyer, the folklorist who would immortalize the legend of the Ogopogo in Canadian consciousness. Susan was a Scottish immigrant, born in the British colony of Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, and raised in both London, England, and Aberdeen, Scotland, who had relocated with her family to Fort Hope at the age of 15. Her stepfather, a spendthrift and gambler, had ambitions of ranching in the Fraser Valley, but abandoned his dreams, his family, and the country when his debts became prohibitively steep. Susan's elder sister, Jane, had married the engineer Edgar Dewdney in 1864 and moved with him to New Westminster, the frontier town at the mouth of the Fraser River, which would grow to become the city of Vancouver, British Columbia. Susan and her mother followed Jane to the seaside community shortly thereafter, but made frequent trips to Fort Hope to visit old friends. It was on one of these sojourns that Susan first met John Fall Allison. Following Edgar and Jane Dewdney's second relocation, this time to Caribou Country north of the Fraser Canyon, where a new gold rush was underway, Susan and her mother moved back to Fort Hope in 1867 and established a small school for the town's children. Shortly thereafter, 42-year-old John Allison began to court Susan, and a year later, the two were married in the chapel at Fort Hope. Then began my camping days, Susan wrote in a later reminiscence, and the wild, free life I ever loved, till age and infirmity put an end to it. On their wedding night, the newlyweds rode east down the Dewdney Trail with all of Susan's belongings, Susan riding side saddle in accordance with Victorian etiquette. They traveled in the company of 3 young Okanagan Indians who worked full-time for John Allison. One of the natives, named Cockshist, was responsible for packing cargo onto the horses. Another, named Johnny Suzanne, was in charge of rounding up the horses and maintaining the riding equipment. The youngest of the 3, a teenager named Yakum Takum, or Tuktak, led the pack train and served as camp cook. It was from these 3 natives that Susan Allison first heard the legend of the Ogopogo. The Allisons decided to spend the night at a stopping place owned by Edgar Dewdney, called Lake House, located about 14 miles east of Fort Hope. Susan recalled the evening in a later reminiscence, writing, "We left town just at dusk, and in a little over an hour reached the lake house, where we found the tents up and a blazing log fire, and Yakum Takum cooking. In the tent, a canvas was spread over the floor, and a bed made of mountain feathers, spruce branches, and a buffalo robe. A wash basin was mounted on the box. Outside, there was the most delicious smell of grouse cooking. I went to the creek and washed, and did up my hair in the darkness, and when I regained the camp, Tuktak had spread a canvas in front of the fire with fried trout, grouse, bacon, and bannock. That was washed down with tin cups of delicious-tasting tea. We sat and talked till late, the Indian boys sitting with us and telling stories of the place. Here, Yakumtakum said, one of the big men, giants, lived, and had been often seen. Coxius said they also lived on the Okanagan. This led to talking of a creature now called Ogopogo. The Indians did not say Ogopogo. They looked on it as a superhuman entity and seemed to fear it, though none of our boys had seen it, nor did they want to. Susan Allison elaborated on Yakumtakum's story in an article published in the September 15, 1934 issue of the Vancouver Province, writing, "The real Indian name of the amphibian now known as Ogopogo I never knew. I suppose the Okanagan Indians had a name for it in their own language, and the Similkameen Indians had theirs, but to me they generally spoke Chinook, and it was spoken of as Ukuk Mekachi Kaupa Lake, the wicked one in the lake, or as the Hias Hias Gust Skaka Kaupa Lae, meaning the huge animal in the lake." Later in her article, Susan gave the creature a third appellation in Chinook jargon, Yakakwansum Stop, which this author, through the use of a Chinook dictionary, has tentatively interpreted as immortal being. This creature they seemed to dread, and spoke of with lowered voices. The Indians were sincere in the awe with which they told their stories. I gathered that the creature was an amphibian. My husband told me the whites spoke of it as the monster, but he said white men had seen it, and though the Indians seemed terrified, he did not believe it. Yakumtakum told of how he had gone to Priest Valley and crossed Okanagan Lake in a canoe, taking a chicken to drop into the lake as an offering. He said the creature would seize the chicken and leave them unmolested. The women in the canoe were so afraid that they threw their shawls over their heads lest they should see it. That was the first time I heard of Ogopogo. The day after their wedding night, the Allisons and their companions continued down the Dewdney Trail to John's ranch at Vermilion Forks. Mr. Allison co-owned this establishment with his business partner and housemate, a cantankerous American named Silas Hayes. Their only neighbors at that time were a handful of American and Chinese prospectors, a few fellow pioneers like themselves, the Hudson's Bay Company employees at Corremios, and members of a local Okanagan Indian band, most of whom spoke little English. For 5 years, the Allisons raised their cattle and reared 3 children out of the ranch on the Similkameen. Susan quickly adapted to the rough lifestyle of a British Columbian pioneer, learning how to trap, shoot, milk cows, and handle cattle, which duties she performed in addition to the regular domestic chores expected of a 19th century wife and mother. Despite the hardships inherent to life on the Canadian frontier, Susan Allison would later look back on her time on the Similkameen with fond nostalgia. Every once in a while, the Allisons' daily routine was punctuated by the arrival of passing travelers, to whom they happily played host. Several of the visitors to darken their cabin's doorway were personages of startling renown, including the aforementioned HBC explorer Alexander Caulfield Anderson, the celebrated geologist and surveyor Dr. George Mercer Dawson, American Civil War hero William Tecumseh Sherman, commanding general of the United States Army, who gifted one of the Allisons' younger sons a cavalry officer's saber, and General Nelson Miles, who would go on to lead American troops in the Indian Wars of the 1870s and serve as the last commanding general of the U.S. Army. After furnishing their guests with cigars and cups of steaming tea, a customary courtesy on the Canadian frontier, the Allisons would often be treated to stories of backcountry adventure, of which no resident of that wild country was ever in short supply. While American prospectors typically spoke of Indian gunfights, distant mining prospects, and legendary bonanzas, native travelers often regaled their guests with hunting stories and tales of extraordinary animals their people saw from time to time in the wilderness. The subjects of the latter tales were often simply gigantic specimens of otherwise prosaic animals, such as an enormous grizzly bear, which one courageous Okanagan chief, who nursed a personal vendetta against the ursine species, single-handedly slayed with his hunting knife. Some of the natives, however, who had a special affinity for Susan Allison, told her tales which were typically reserved for Indian ears alone, of wild giants who lived in the mountains, antlered men with the wings of a bat who haunted the forests of the Similkameen, and the preternatural monster of Okanagan Lake. While her husband scoffed at such yarns, Susan was fascinated by the native legends and entertained her children by relating them at night by lantern light. As one of the Allisons' guests, a poet and big game hunter named Clive Phillips Wally put it in his 1988 travel memoir, A Sportsman's Eden, in the winter, the young ones at least while away the long evenings with storytelling, their mother collecting the wild fairy legends of the Indians and dressing them in familiar language for her children. In the autumn of 1873, the Allisons and Silas Hayes left their ranch in the Similkameen and relocated to a place they called Sunnyside, located on the western shores of Okanagan Lake, about 50 miles northeast of Princeton, across the lake from Father Pandozzi's mission. By that time, a handful of white pioneers had already taken up permanent residence on the lake's shore, joining the oblate missionaries who had tended their native flock from the banks of Mission Creek for 13 years. The priest's first long-term non-native neighbors, who settled near the mission in the early 1860s, included a retired HBC packer named William Peon, a French-Canadian prospector named Cyprien Lawrence and his Flathead Indian wife, Teresa, a French veteran of the Crimean War named Eli Lequim, who ran a trading post with his French wife, Marie-Louise, and a Métis trapper, trader, and ex-HBC packer named Johnny McDougall, who was famed throughout the region for his carpentry skills. Since 1864, brothers Charles and Forbes Vernon, retired officers of the British Army, had settled at the site of the city which would come to bear their name. The Vernon brothers were joined in 1867 by a French-Canadian prospector named Luc Giroir, who planted the region's first vineyard nearby. And since 1869, an Irishman named Thomas Ellis had raised cattle on a ranch at what is now the city of Penticton. Newcomers to the valley included a miller named Fred Brent, brothers Joseph, Louis, and Thomas Christian, and a miner named Isidore Boucherie, all of whom took up residence near the Mission Church. Similar to Susan's relocation to the Similkameen 5 years earlier, the Allisons made their journey to their new home in the company of their friends Cockshist, Johnny Suzanne, and Yakum Takum. Their progress was painfully slow, hampered as it was by the cattle they drove before them down the narrow and sometimes treacherous game trails. At the end of their first day on the road, they stopped to make camp at a place called Trout Creek, just southeast of present-day Summerland. After Yakum Takum had finished cooking dinner, and the company was all settled around the campfire, the natives began to tell stories about the Okanagan Valley's preternatural denizens. Yakum Takum told yarns about the big men who live in the mountains, Susan wrote in a later reminiscence, and the creature now known as Ogopogo. The Indians did not call him that, but spoke of it as if it were some supernatural entity, and pointed out where it lived on an island in Okanagan Lake as we passed the spot. My husband always laughed at the Indians' yarns, but I did not, for I thought there must be some foundation for what they said. They told me more than they told most white people. In her aforementioned piece in the Vancouver province, Susan Allison indirectly identified the alleged abode of the Ogopogo as Rattlesnake Island. They said, she wrote, when he got hold of a man or deer, he would drag it there and devour it on the rocks, which were stained with blood, and on which there were piles of bleached bones. This was its home. The Indians said no boat could possibly land on the island, for the monster would cause a strong wind to blow and baffle the attempt. So I got the impression that the monster was something more than an amphibian. It was always in some way connected with high winds. Susan went on to relate how Charles and Forbes Vernon had tried to land on this island and were driven off by strong winds, and how the monster is also said to have swamped the canoe of 2 native fishermen and carried both unfortunates down to the bottom of the lake. Frank Buckland elaborated on the lake monster's legendary association with strong winds in Ogopogo's vigil, hinting that it was said to create large waves and whip up powerful winds by thrashing its tail. in his enumeration of the various activities by which the natives would entertain themselves while waiting for their wheat berries to be ground to flour at Fred Brandt's mill, Buckland wrote, "Stories might be recounted of an adventure with a grizzly, or the latest antics of Enha-Itk, the lake monster, a monster that was said to have its home in a cave under Squally Point, but when a native had occasion to speak its name, he did so with bated breath." This terrifying creature would race up and down the lake at times, we are told, heaving water with its tail, making a great wind, preparing to devour any unprepared Indian who might be caught out in a canoe. The morning following their camp at Trout Creek, the Allisons and their companions resumed their slow march to Sunnyside. "When I first sighted the beautiful Okanagan," Susan wrote in a later reminiscence, "it was in a dead calm. The distant mountains were reflected in its mysterious depths. A deep silence prevailed. The Indians, unused to vast water stretches, ceased their merry talk and gazed at the blue waters with awe." Shortly after reaching Sunnyside, the Allisons met up with a Métis trapper and carpenter, Johnny McDougall, whom John Allison had contracted to build their cabin. The company ate dinner together, and after the children had gone to bed, the Indians began to swap hunting stories. After reminiscing over a nearly fatal accident, which befell one of the Vernon brothers during a hunting trip, talk shifted to the monster of Okanagan Lake. Johnny McDougall informed his astonished audience that, some years earlier, he had encountered the mysterious creature while swimming a team of horses across the lake at a place called the Narrows, a strip of water between what is now Kelowna and West Kelowna, traversed today by the William R. Bennett Bridge. On that fateful day, his horses seemed unusually reluctant to enter the water. When he led them to the edge of the lake, they balked, as if terrified by the presence of some unseen menace therein. He finally managed to coax some of his animals into the water, only to have them bolt back to the shore in a wild panic, thoroughly spooked by something in the depths. Finally, the Métis roped his animals together and succeeded in guiding them out into the water in his canoe, assisted by 2 Indian boys who drove the horses from behind. Johnny McDougall had long since adopted Yakumtakum's practice of throwing a chicken or piglet into the water when he was about halfway across the lake, in order to appease the monster that lurked below. Although he had brought a sacrificial animal along with him for this particular operation, he had forgotten it on the shore in the excitement. By the time he realized his error, he had already reached the middle of the lake. "Suddenly," wrote Susan Allison in her memoir, "something, he couldn't see what, dragged the horses down underwater, and the canoe he was in would have gone too, had he not severed the rope with his sheath knife and hurried across. He never saw any vestige of his team again." The Allisons would spend 9 years on their Sunnyside property before financial difficulties forced them to return to their old cabin on the Similkameen. Susan, in later reminiscences, recalled her time on the shores of Okanagan Lake as the happiest years of her life, a glorious decade, interspersed with several hair-raising adventures, including a run-in with a gang of notorious Métis outlaws, a powwow that nearly resulted in a war between the Okanagan Nation and the U.S. Army, and an incident in which Susan's husband and eldest son narrowly escaped being crushed to death by floating plates of lake ice. Of all of Susan Allison's exhilarating experiences on Okanagan Lake, perhaps the most fascinating was her very own sighting of the amphibious monster of which her Indian friends had long spoken. Susan described her encounter in a handwritten reminiscence, an edited version of which made it into the aforementioned article in the Vancouver province. Sometime in the late 1870s, the story goes, John Allison and one of his sons had some business on the eastern side of Okanagan Lake, at the trading post of Eli Laquim, and rowed over in their canoe to conduct it. That evening, a terrific storm descended upon the lake, breaking the tips off strong pine trees on the mountain slopes and plateau, and hurling them about like straw. The tempest, of course, rendered canoe travel impossible, obliging John Allison and his son to spend the night at the Catholic mission. Toward morning, Susan wrote, I went to a cliff overlooking the lake, to see if there was any chance of our boat returning from the mission. The wind was indeed subsided, but there was still a strong current sweeping down to Penticton, too strong still for our light little boat. The sun was shining, and I stood on the cliff admiring the beautiful lake, when I observed below the harbor what at first I took for an uprooted pine. I was trying to think where it could have been torn from. Then I observed that, instead of floating down the lake with the current, it was coming rapidly up the lake toward where I stood. It passed the harbor and still came on with a swift undulatory motion, just like a huge low in the water going the wrong way. I watched it pass me and disappear around a bend, feeling convinced that it was a living creature. It looked just like the trunk of a huge pine, but I saw neither head nor tail. It was not a bit like the serpent since seen by others, but it might have been a big saurian, and I am convinced that it was one. However, when my husband and boy returned from the mission, I told them what I had seen. They laughed at me and said that a fellow had come to the mission and reported seeing the same thing from the other side of the lake, but they thought he had been drinking. I think the storm the night before, which was of unusual violence, had driven it from its lair. In a letter she wrote to the editor of the Vancouver Sunday Province, which was printed in the August 15th, 1926 issue of that publication, Susan Allison identified the other witness as a Welshman named Thomas Smitheram, the superintendent of a nearby mine. Since then, Allison concluded, I have known men who say they have heard the monster at night, in a swampy meadow, and thinking their pack horse had broken loose, they went to look for them, but saw nothing. Their horses were still tied on the plateau. Following the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, or CPR, through the northerly community of Sicamous in 1885, settlers from Europe and eastern Canada began to trickle into Okanagan country and establish themselves in the burgeoning communities of Kelowna, Vernon, and Penticton. The increase in population created a demand for freight and passenger transportation, which a succession of lake boat captains satisfied throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. According to Mary Moon, many of these freshwater mariners had encounters with the Ogopogo during their multi-day trips across the lake. The first professional freighter and ferryman to ply the waters of Okanagan Lake was Captain Thomas Doman Shorts, a persevering but chronically luckless entrepreneur who began his career in 1883 in a rowboat he christened the Ruth Shorts in honor of his mother. In the numerous trips of the craft, wrote Captain Joseph B. Weeks, one of Short's successors, in an article for the 1931 Report of the Okanagan Historical Society, the skipper was not hampered by any time schedule. When pushing off with his load of passengers or freight, if asked by any of them when he would get there, he invariably replied, "Haven't the slightest idea, but rest assured we'll fetch up there sometime." The time taken for the round trip was generally 9 days, and wherever night overtook him, the Ruth Shorts was paddled ashore, and the crew camped for the night. Captain Shorts attempted to give his arms and back a much-needed break 3 years later, when he purchased a kerosene-powered paddle wheeler he named the Mary Victoria Greenhow. Like all of his subsequent business ventures, Short's first foray into the world of steam power ended in disaster. Halfway into her maiden voyage across the lake, his new steamer consumed all the fuel with which she had been supplied, forcing her mortified captain to row to shore and, hat in hand, beg for kerosene from the lakeside settlers. In typical frontier fashion, the Okanagan pioneers cheerfully gave the hapless mariner every last drop of their lantern oil, bidding him bon voyage by candlelight. Their sacrifice, unfortunately, was for naught. On her return journey to Okanagan Landing, her port of embarkation, the Mary Victoria Greenhow caught fire and was damaged beyond repair by the time she limped into the northerly harbor. The following year, in 1887, Short salvaged the engine from the charred paddle wheeler and built a wood-burning steamboat called the SS Jubilee. This new steamer became encased in ice in the winter of 1889, and when she sank that spring as a result of the winter damage, her engine was put into a new steamer called the City of Vernon. Captain Shorts built his third and final steamboat, the SS Penticton, in 1890, with the help of rancher Thomas Ellis. It was from the wheelhouse of this vessel, Merrymoon contended, that Shorts saw a strange creature in Okanagan Lake. One sweltering day in the summer of 1890, while guiding his ship over the lake, Shorts spotted a 15-foot-long animal with translucent fins and a head like a ram, swimming alone near the water's surface. After a few moments, the creature dove out of sight. Shorts captained the SS Penticton for 2 years, before selling it to Leon Lequim, son of the French traders Eli and Marie-Louise, for $5,000, thus terminating his painful 9-year career. In the decades following Captain Short's sighting, some of the earliest residents of Kelowna, Vernon, and other communities throughout Okanagan country purportedly spotted an unusual creature in Okanagan Lake. One of these was an elderly French cook named Frank Stevens, who lived with a group of boat builders and steamboat freighters on a ranch on the lake's eastern shore, between what is now Kelowna and Vernon. Stevens' housemate, an English immigrant named Northcott H. Caesar, described Stevens' sighting in both his autobiography, entitled A Record of a Life, and an article published in the 13th report of the Okanagan Historical Society in 1949. One day in 1896, Stevens went out onto Okanagan Lake in a rowboat, intending to catch some fish near a tiny isle known today as Grant Island, located a short distance from the ranch. He returned to the ranch house later that day in a state of agitation, declaring that he had seen a sea-serpent. He described it as about 20 feet long, Caesar wrote in his 1949 article, with a head rather like a sheep's, held about 3 feet above the water. He had seen it fairly close to him, near the island owned by G.M. Gibson. I am afraid we teased him a good deal and put no stock in his story. Later travelers and residents have given almost the same description, so I think there must have been something in the lake the day Frank was out. What was it? Another Okanagan pioneer to catch a glimpse of the lake's legendary inmate was Mrs. Ruth Richardson, whose parents once owned a lakeside cottage at Okanagan Landing. Many writers have incorrectly dated Richardson's sighting to the year 1900, probably misinterpreting a statement in Mary Moon's book, which placed the sighting around the turn of the 20th century. Richardson herself, who was born in 1900, made it clear in a 1978 interview, excerpts of which were published in various Canadian newspapers in late November of that year, that the event took place in 1906. While playing on a beach outside her family's summer cottage, 6-year-old Ruth heard a strange noise in the water. "I was building my sandcastles," she told an interviewer, "when I heard an awful kerplush of a heavy body. I looked up, and there were 2 huge eyes looking right at me, from in front of me about 25 feet away. I was frightened. I was paralyzed." The 2 huge eyes, Mrs. Richardson explained, were attached to a scaly, prehistoric-looking horse-like head, standing about 3 feet out of the water. The head was attached to a long, snake-like body, which she estimated to have a length of about 10 meters, or 33 feet. In another interview, published in the May 1969 issue of the Vernon News, she stated that she saw 3 fins standing on the back of the creature's neck. "I can see that old devil this minute," Richardson declared. "I'll never forget the thing till my dying day." The creature stared back at her for some time, with what Ruth perceived to be an air of curiosity, before silently slipping back into the water. "Once you get a look at it, you want to stay on the ground," Richardson concluded. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Canadian Pacific Railway constructed 3 of its own steamboats for service on Okanagan Lake. The first of these was a 46-foot-long sternwheeler called the SS Aberdeen, built in 1892 in the wake of Thomas Short's retirement. In stark contrast with the erratic practices of Captain Short's, the crew of the Aberdeen operated on a tight schedule, making a trip up or down the lake, from Okanagan Landing to Penticton or vice versa, every day of the week but Sunday. The Aberdeen was joined by a larger, faster, and more luxurious companion, the CPR's SS Okanagan, And in 1914, the CPR's Okanagan fleet welcomed its third and most magnificent member, the triple-decker SS Sicamous, nicknamed the Queen of the Okanagan. While conducting research for her book, Mary Moon corresponded with an old fireman, or stoker, named William B. Folkert, who had shoveled coal into the fireboxes of the CPR's Okanagan steamboats in the early 1900s. In 1923, Folkert told Moon in one of his letters, Captain Matt Reed of the SS Okanagan used to see Ogopogo occasionally, in the early evenings on hot summer days, as we were going southward round Rattlesnake Point, directly across from Peachland. Captain Reed had also seen it near Westbank, about 40 feet in length, with a head like a horse. According to Folkert, another captain of the SS Okanagan, the aforementioned Joseph B. Weeks, had a habit of blowing the ship's whistle to alert passengers whenever the Ogopogo surfaced, during his runs in 1923 and 1924, as did his contemporary, Angus McKinnon, who piloted a tugboat called the Naramata. Folkert's tantalizing testimony is tempered by Weeks' own July 1926 statement to the Vernon News that he had never seen anything out of the ordinary during his career, a status that would change 6 years later as the result of an event which we will examine later in this piece. The notion of monster sightings from the decks of steamboats is bolstered by a strange tale that R. Lecky Ewing heard from a stewardess who served aboard one of the CPR's Okanagan steamboats in the 1920s. One day, during a routine trip across the lake, the stewardess engaged in small talk with two greenhorns from eastern Canada. In the midst of their conversation, one of the men casually remarked, "We did not know you had crocodiles in the lake," explaining to the astonished stewardess that he and his companion had seen just such an animal break the water south of Peachland. The late summer and early autumn of 1925 saw a massive surge of public interest in the alleged monster of Okanagan Lake. The frenzy grew to such an extent that, by September, would-be monster hunters could be seen casually patrolling the lake in their canoes or lying in wait on the shore with rifles at the ready. This furor was touched off, apparently, by a spate of British Columbian newspaper articles proposing that the strange creature spotted from time to time in the cold, clear waters of the Okanagan is really a giant sturgeon, a notion publicly championed by the province's Deputy Commissioner of Fisheries, John P. Babcock, but vehemently condemned by many of those who claim to have actually seen the monster. From late August until early November, newspapers across Canada and the United States served as forums in which scientists, regional authorities, and eyewitnesses fiercely debated the identity of the lake's mysterious denizen, prominent candidates being a giant aquatic serpent, a freshwater manatee or sea cow, and a specimen of some ancient, long-necked, and large-bodied marine reptile. Concurrent with this controversy were several spectacular and rapidly successive sightings of the monster itself, all of them made in mid-August. The first witness, a man named James Mitchell, claimed to have seen the partially submerged body of a long, dark animal wiggling beneath the waves while boating from Penticton to his home in what is now West Kelowna. Mitchell assured reporters that the creature he saw bore no resemblance to a sturgeon, and likened its head, which stood about 2 feet above the water, to that of a snake's. Although the reptile's crown and back were quite dark, its body resembling a large stovepipe in shape and color, the skin which covered its jaws and underbelly was of a paler hue. Several days after Mitchell's sighting, on the morning of August 17th, a man named James Mitchell Boyd had his own close encounter with the lake's unusual occupant, near his home on the Okanagan's northwestern shore. While fishing from his canoe, Boyd noticed a dark, 30-foot-long object floating in the water about 300 yards away from him. He assumed the object was a downed tree and took little notice of it, until it began to move slowly across his bow, giving him a good look at its sheep-like head as it glided past. 3 days later, while rafting on the lake in the afternoon, local boys William Andrews, Ken Booth, and brothers Alan and Bob Butler spotted a long object resembling a stovepipe, which they first took to be a log, floating on the water's surface. The thing suddenly dove out of sight, creating a substantial swell which marred the lake's glassy surface, and nearly upset the boys' crafts, convincing the young adventurers and other shoreside witnesses that they had seen the monster of Okanagan Lake. The mania that the 1925 controversy engendered reached a fevered pitch in July 1926, a month which began on an ominous note, when 2 out-of-town visitors mysteriously drowned in Okanagan Lake. Although no newspapermen dared commit the irreverence of proposing a connection between these tragedies and the lake's most famous resident, the latter found its way back into British Columbian headlines following a dramatic sighting which occurred on the morning of July 19, 1926. The witness was Mr. John Logan Logie, manager of a Kelowna-based land development company and associated irrigation and power company, whom one newspaper article described as one of the best and most favorably known men in the Okanagan for the past 20 years. Early that morning, Mr. Logie, accompanied by his wife Isabella and 2 of his grandchildren, commenced a long drive from Summerland to Logie's place of business north of Kelowna, the first leg of which took them all the way up the lake's western shore. Not long after their departure, on a stretch of road just north of Peachland, which overlooks Okanagan Lake, the party spotted an unusual swell in the water near the shore on the right-hand side. The lake was perfectly calm at the time, Logie told the Vernon News, and this brought our attention to the fact that something must be causing the undulations we saw. At the time, we were traveling about 25 miles an hour, and as we gained on what appeared to be causing the swell, we discovered that it was a rather strange-looking animal. Traveling alongside it, we had every opportunity of observing the creature, as it was less than 50 feet from the shore. What was our surprise to see that it resembled very much the descriptions of that strange sea-serpent, so-called, that we had heard so much about. There was the head, resembling very much that of a sheep, with a pointed nose. The body was dark in color, showing above the water about the size of the mudguard on a car. Extending back from the head, there was visible about 15 feet of it. How much longer the lake monster was, we could not tell, yet there it was, racing alongside the car with marvelous speed, making the spray fly, and producing a swell over a foot high. Hearing our voices in the car, it dived down, reappearing some 30 or 40 feet ahead of us, having gained some little distance as we had slowed the car down. We continued to run alongside of it, until the road turned up a hill, and we saw the monster turn out into the lake, just before it came to the Trepanier Wharf, the latter being a bygone dock which once lay north of Peachland. A short distance behind us, Logie continued, was another car containing P.J. Dodwell of Summerland and a lady, who also saw this strange creature some distance out in the lake. They had once said, without knowing what we had seen, that this must be that famous sea-serpent. Of the reality of some strange creature in the lake, there is now no doubt whatever, as the 4 of us who were in the car saw this creature at close quarters, and had every opportunity to observe what it was like. In no picture or story have I ever seen or heard described any animal like that we saw. Poke fun, if you like, at this lake monster. Draw caricatures of it, if doing so will afford any amusement. But remember at the same time that it has ceased to be a thing of the imagination, but is something that is very real, as we have observed from a close and actual experience, and had an opportunity of running it in a race in a Chevrolet car. Where are the naturalists that can now tell us what is this lake animal, fish, snake, or monster? Those who have expressed open doubt as to the existence of such a monster, concluded an article in the Vernon News which covered the story, are inclined to be less skeptical now that Mr. Logie has recorded his observations, noting that Logie was a prominent and well-respected citizen, whose veracity was unquestioned throughout the Okanagan. The monster was spotted several more times throughout July and August, some witnesses claiming that they first mistook it for an upturned boat, others asserting that it resembled an animated log, and others still declaring that they saw its body rise out of the water in 5 distinct loops, each of which resembled an automobile tire. One article in the August 7, 1926 issue of the Nanaimo Free Press stated that within the last 3 weeks, it has been seen 4 or 5 times by 9 or 10 different people, some of whom claim to have obtained a pretty close view of it. Like many locals today, Canadians who lived along the shores of Okanagan Lake in the summer of 1926 regarded their backyard monster with a combination of light-hearted raillery and silent wariness. A group of local jokesters, for example, built an imitation of the lake monster out of old car tires and scrap metal for the Kelowna Regatta, a beloved water sports competition which had been held on Okanagan Lake every summer since 1906. On August 11th, the opening day of the festival, the pranksters paraded their effigy across the lake by tugboat, much to the delight of shoreside spectators. In contrast with this carnivalic frivolity, by the end of the same month, the Canadian Pacific Railway was seriously considering equipping its Okanagan Sternwheelers with devices designed to repel monster attacks, a precaution which local newspapers mercilessly lampooned. On August 23, 1926, Okanagan Lake's now famous monster was christened the unusual name by which we know it today, Ogopogo. This strange-sounding appellation does not derive from some ancient Okanagan designation for the monster of Okanagan Lake, but rather from a short comedic poem written as the lyrics to an English foxtrot, penned in 1924 by lyricist Cumberland Clark and composer Mark Strong. That day, a Vernon vocalist named Bill Brimblecombe recited a parody of the Old World ditty to delegates of the Vancouver Board of Trade, for whom the Vernon Rotary Club was hosting a luncheon. The adulterated lyrics of Brimblecombe's tune, written by Vernon's H.F. Beattie, were tailored to fit the Okanagan Lake monster. They read,
I'm looking for the Ogopogo, the bunny-hugging Ogopogo. His mother was a mutton and his father was a whale. I'm going to put a little bit of salt on his tail. I want to find the Ogopogo, as told to me by Howard Joe. For the Lieutenant Governor, the Lieutenant Governor, the Lieutenant Governor wants to put him in the BC show.
Journalist Ronald Kenvin of the Vancouver-based newspaper The Daily Province, in his article in the next day's issue of that publication, went along with the implications of Brimblecombe's parody and applied the title of the tune to the monster of Okanagan Lake, declaring in his piece's headline, Ogopogo now official name of the famous Okanagan sea-serpent. Kenvin's tacit proposal was instantly and universally accepted, and ever since, the monster of Okanagan Lake has been known as the Ogopogo. While the Ogopogo was confounding motorists and terrifying steamboat passengers on Okanagan Lake, its more illustrious cousin was preparing to make its own splash on the far side of the world. From its misty origins in local folklore to the media hype it engendered throughout the 20th century, the tale of Scotland's Loch Ness monster eerily parallels that of its Okanagan counterpart. Rather than the oral traditions of the Okanagan Indians, the story of the Loch Ness monster can be traced back to the legends of the Picts and Gaels, who held sole dominion over the kingdom they called Alba during the early and high Middle Ages. Since the days of Saint Columba, an Irish abbot who brought Christianity to Old Caledonia in the 6th century, medieval Scots told stories about a monster which haunted the River Ness, a waterway which drains its appendant loch into the North Sea. Scottish tradition identifies this monster as a kelpie, a shape-shifting water spirit, which appears to people as a black horse, also known as an echwishka, or water horse. This mystical being had a penchant for luring humans to its watery abode, where it would drown and devour them, consuming everything but their entrails. Similar to the Ogopogo, many early 20th century witnesses of the Loch Ness monster described the subject of their sightings as a succession of undulating humps, or a single hump which they initially mistook for a boat turned upside down. Like the monster of Okanagan Lake, it has featured in many controversial photos and videos over the years, and has inspired scientific expeditions in search of it. Many Canadians might be surprised to learn that the Loch Ness monster graduated from an obscure local legend to a national sensation a full 7 years after the Ogopogo's own 1926 rise to fame. Specifically, the Scottish monster's road to stardom began on April 14, 1933, when a startling encounter on the northeastern end of the loch touched off a flurry of sightings that found their ways into British newspapers throughout that spring and summer. Its subsequent elevation to an international celebrity far surpassing that of its Canadian cousin is a testament to the proficiency of early 20th century British journalism. In the century following the Ogopogo's official naming, hundreds of eyewitnesses have reported their own encounters with the elusive lake monster and its supposed progeny. Many of these accounts were diligently documented in Mary Moon's aforementioned 1977 book Ogopogo, The Okanagan Mystery. This author cannot hope to improve upon this exhaustive chronology, and has therefore decided to condense the many sightings detailed therein into a statistical comparison of the particulars of each witness's account. From Johnny McDougall's experience in the 1860s until the publication of Moon's book in 1977, monster encounters have been reported in nearly every corner of the lake, from Vernon in the north to Penticton in the south. As might be expected, sightings are generally concentrated around Okanagan Lake's 5 major communities, the vast majority having been reported in the narrow waters between the metropolises of Kelowna and West Kelowna. This, of course, is not necessarily an indication that the mysterious monster of Okanagan Lake spends most of its time haunting the outskirts of human settlements, but is very possibly a reflection of the fact that sightings can only be made in places where witnesses are present. In deviation from this general pattern, a scattering of sightings have also been made in more desolate stretches of water, namely in the lake's northernmost quarter, in the vicinity of Squally Point, and in the southerly expanse separating Summerland from Penticton. Although sightings have been made in every season of the year, the Ogopogo appears most frequently in the summer. July seems to be its most active month by far, followed distantly by August, and although the monster has been spotted at all times of the day and night, it typically presents itself to unsuspecting witnesses in the afternoon, generally between the hours of 3 and 6 p.m. Readers with a knowledge of the climatic conditions which prevail in Okanagan country may recognize that the conjunction of these temporal periods marks the hottest time of year in Okanagan country, July afternoons in the Okanagan Valley often being oppressively hot. Indeed, many witnesses and researchers have observed that the monster seems to make its appearance during the most sweltering spells of summer, when neither the barest wisp of cloud nor the faintest whisper of a breeze can be found to check the steady glare of the afternoon sun. You can feel when it's Ogopogo weather, witness Connie Marlowe informed Mary Moon. The lake is very calm and limpid, and the weather is hot. This sentiment was echoed by witness Ernest A. Lording, who told Moon, "You can always find him in very hot and still weather." As witness Leslie Carey put it, the hotter the weather, the better your chances of seeing Ogopogo are. Although native legend has not furnished us with a clear notion of the Ogopogo's physical appearance, witness descriptions of the monster paint a consistent picture of a long aquatic animal with a bestial head. Those who claim to have seen the creature are not all in agreement as to its length. While the vast majority estimate that the creature measures between 15 to 20 feet from its nose to the tip of its tail, a sizable minority claim that the creature they saw was at least 40 to 50 feet long. Outlying estimates propose that the creature could be as short as 6 feet and as long as 75 feet, the latter being the approximate length of a blue whale, the largest animal known to man. All witnesses agree that the Ogopogo is dark in color, its skin most often being described as black, almost black, dark green, or brownish green. A minority contend that it appears gray or blue-gray. Most claim that its skin is smooth-looking and shiny. Some believe that the Ogopogo has scales, while a small minority are under the impression that it is covered with some kind of hair. Most witnesses describe the Ogopogo's body as snake-like, and many claim that it had fins along its back. The creature most frequently appeared to witnesses as a succession of 2 or more equidistant humps, rising several feet out of the water, the humps presumably being the crests of the wave-like pose into which the animal contorted itself, as if its serpentine torso were frozen in the process of undergoing some sort of vertical oscillation. In many cases, the humps then proceeded swiftly along the water's surface, either rhythmically bobbing up and down in a manner suggestive of vertical undulation, or gliding smoothly across the water without changing vertically at all. One encounter which epitomizes this most common sort of Ogopogo sighting is that of Mr. and Mrs. Dick H. Miller, Mr. and Mrs. Pat Martin, Pat being Mrs. Miller's brother, and the Martins' 6-year-old son, Murray. On July 17, 1959, while returning to Vernon after a day of boating, Dick Miller saw something unusual in the boat's wake, which appeared to be swimming faster than their watercraft. Intrigued, he asked his brother-in-law to turn the boat around. Their subsequent about-face afforded the 5 family members an excellent view of the creature. In an article published in the July 20, 1959 issue of the Vernon Guardian, Miller wrote that the animal had 5 humps and a snake-like head. Ogie did not appear to like the boat coming at him broadside, he wrote, so very gracefully, he reduced the 5 humps which are so plainly visible, lowered his head, and gradually submerged. Miller was adamant that the creature he saw did not undulate vertically, but rather glided forward, without altering its peculiar wavy posture. A snake, when swimming in water, gets its forward propulsion by moving its body in a sideways motion, he wrote. This sea serpent does not. It glides very gracefully, in a smooth, direct forward motion. This would lead me to believe that in between the humps, it possibly has some type of fins it works together, or possibly individually, to control direction. Before we proceed, it is perhaps worth our while to clarify the meaning of the word undulation, an unusual term which seldom finds its way into casual conversation, which is nevertheless very commonly used to describe the motion and posture of the Ogopogo. The Oxford English Dictionary defines undulation as the action of moving in a wave-like manner, a gentle rising and falling in the manner of waves. In zoology, the word is applied to 2 types of locomotion by which animals propel themselves forward. The first of these is lateral undulation, in which an animal slithers or wriggles its body from side to side, producing a sideways or lateral wave. All aquatic snakes, eels, and fish swim in this fashion. The second type of animal undulation is dorsoventral or vertical undulation, in which an animal flexes its spine or tail up and down, producing vertical waves. This method of locomotion is used by aquatic mammals, like whales and seals, and uniquely by leeches. Despite its snake-like appearance, few, if any, Ogopogo witnesses claimed that the subject of their sighting moved through the water like an aquatic snake, through lateral undulation. Many, however, describe seeing the Ogopogo swim by vertical undulation, in the manner of a leech or a whale. And many more, like Dick Miller, have stated that the Ogopogo does not actually undulate, but rather maintains a wavy posture while gliding smoothly through the water. According to several witnesses who saw the Ogopogo assume its classic wave-like posture, the humps reportedly stood so high out of the water that they formed half loops, much like those which characterize the torso of the iconic Ogopogo sculpture, which stands in Kelowna's Kerry Park. Among the most dramatic of such sightings is that reported by Lydia Maud Hodgson, who came upon an unusual scene on July 21, 1923, while riding her horse along the shores of Okanagan Landing. According to contemporary articles in the Summerland Review and the Vernon News, which Mary Moon paraphrased in her book, Hodgson saw what she first thought was an upturned boat, lying between the shore and a cluster of nearby reeds. As she approached the wreck, it rose smoothly up and out of the water, transforming into a huge snake-like creature, with a head like a sheep, and 2 horns or ears protruding from its crown. The animal's torso formed 5 loops, which rose so high above the water surface that she could plainly see the empty space between them. While the creature surveyed the area with its eyes, Hodgson called out for her son, Walter, desiring that he too might lay his eyes upon the legendary lake monster. Startled by the sound of her voice, the Ogopogo slipped back into the water and darted away with breathtaking speed, leaving a subtle trail of foam in its wake. 3 years after Hodgson's encounter, on July 29, 1926, another woman had a similar experience at Cameron Point, about 5 kilometers southwest of Okanagan Landing, at the very spot where Okanagan Indians told R. Lecky Ewing the Big Lake Devil abided. While sitting near the wharf at Cameron Point, one Mrs. Jervis of Kelowna saw a large, slimy, snake-like creature emerge from the water to form 3 distinct arcs, which she said looked something like portions of 3 automobile tires. Her story was corroborated by a local named H.C. Dalziels, who saw the same creature and shouted at it in the hope that it would raise its head out of the water. Instead, the creature balked at the sound of his voice and slipped back below the surface. The second most common posture in which 20th century witnesses found the Ogopogo was a relaxed and prone position, which gave it the appearance of a log floating atop the water. Only when the log moved, marring its pole-like straightness by either breaking into its curvy posture or diving beneath the water, did witnesses realize its animal nature. As we have already learned, many of those who saw the Ogopogo in this form claimed that they first mistook it for a downed tree, while several in the early 1900s remarked that it resembled a large stovepipe in both shape and coloring. Typical of such sightings was that of Mrs. Alice Allison Wright, the daughter of pioneer Susan Allison, and Alice's own daughter, Mrs. J.H. Sisson, both of whom claimed to have seen the Ogopogo in the waters off West Kelowna in July 1962. In a description of their experience, which she included in a letter to the Kelowna Chamber of Commerce in March 1970, Alice Wright wrote, "There, not 100 feet from us, was a long black pole, a very large pole-like black object on the surface of the water. It had suddenly appeared. Then, in quick succession, up came 1, 2, 3 humps on its back, like enormous tires. Then the head, then a long, slender neck. The pole had transformed itself into a living creature. It paused, as if to get its bearings or balance. Then, in a lordly, unhurried way, it proceeded down the lake towards Penticton." While roughly half of the witnesses in Mary Moon's book declared that the Ogopogo's head remained underwater throughout the entirety of their experience, the remainder claimed that the creature's serpentine body was attached to a strange animalic cranium, which bore no resemblance to that of a sturgeon or any other fish they knew. Most claimed that the head most closely resembled that of a sheep, while nearly the same number likened it to that of a horse. A few compared it to that of a snake or a seal, while a small minority said that it reminded them of a ram, a bulldog, an alligator, or a bucket. Taken together, the Ogopogo sightings of the 20th century paint a relatively consistent portrait of a dark, 20-foot-long, serpent-like animal, with dorsal fins and the head of a sheep, which either propels itself by undulating vertically, or glides through the water in a wave-like posture. It is most commonly spotted on hot and windless July afternoons, and is most often seen racing across the surface of the water at astonishing speed before diving. Several witnesses have reported seeing it wriggling or thrashing around near the surface of the water, floating lazily atop the water, sunbathing on a beach, or tearing around in circles on the water's surface as if chasing its tail. Chillingly, some witnesses, like Alice Wright, J.H. Sisson, and Lydia Hodgson, proclaimed that the Ogopogo's head was crowned with 2 tall protrusions resembling horns or ears. These mysterious appendages evoke an ancient legend, unaccountably shared by First Nations across the continent, which features in as disparate traditions as that of the Haida of the Pacific Northwest, the Blackfoot of the Prairies, the Ojibwe of the Great Lakes, and the Mi'kmaq of the Maritimes. According to this strange universal folktale, into which a brief digression here is perhaps warranted, a giant horned water serpent once haunted North America's oceans, lakes, and rivers. This entity was said to be saturated with preternatural power, and was considered the mortal enemy of the Thunderbird. Like the Naitaka, to which the Okanagan Indians of antiquity were said to have sacrificed live dogs in order to ensure their safe passage through his waters, the horned serpent of Pan-American tradition is said to have demanded blood tributes from the natives with whom he interacted, often as payment for the assurance of calm waters, or for the conference of preternatural powers. For example, 18th century fur trader Alexander Henry the Elder, in his memoirs, described how the Ojibwe of Lake Michigan threw live dogs from their canoes in an attempt to appease some unnamed elemental deity they believed controlled the weather on the Great Lakes. This entity was likely Mishapishu, a huge horned aquatic creature of Ojibwe legend, which fits into this transcontinental tradition. In one of his own memoirs, 19th century German travel writer Johann Georg Kohl described another Ojibwe tradition, which told of a giant water snake who once granted an Indian chief special powers in return for the lives of his wife and children. Like the monster that swallowed Chief Timbasket on Okanagan Lake, this diabolical serpent had the ability to create huge whirlpools, which, incidentally, caused the water level on Lake Superior to rise. In his 1894 newspaper series, Indian Tales of the Canadian Prairies, Scots Cree frontiersman James Francis Sanderson described an ancient Blackfoot and Cree legend, which told of a giant serpent in the South Saskatchewan River, which gifted a chief a powerful medicine bonnet in exchange for the sacrifice of his wife. And on Prince Edward Island, in Atlantic Canada, the Mi'kmaq told stories of a giant lake serpent, which gave a chief a healing stone in return for the life of his daughter. Like Cole's serpent and the creature that killed Timbasket, this water snake of Mi'kmaq legend had the ability to create flood-causing whirlpools. The next chapter in the saga of the Ogopogo is thoroughly chronicled in the writings of the late Kelowna author Arlene Gull, who, prior to her death in the autumn of 2021, was considered by many to be the preeminent authority on all things Ogopogo. In her 1976 book, Beneath the Depths, her 1984 book, Ogopogo, The True Story of the Okanagan Lake $1 Million Monster, and her 2001 book, In Search of Ogopogo, Sacred Creature of the Okanagan Waters, Gull painted verbal pictures of several controversial videos of the creature taken throughout the latter half of the 20th century, some of which were purchased for exorbitant sums of money, described several film crew expeditions launched in search of the monster, in a few of which she participated as a consultant, and detailed many Ogopogo sightings made in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, most accounts of which she heard firsthand from the witnesses themselves. Her extensive research and personal experience led her to develop a conception of the Ogopogo, which deviates radically from the horned, multi-humped water serpent of popular perception. Although she never explicitly ventured an opinion as to the nature of Okanagan's most elusive occupant in any of her 3 books, her interpretations of suspected Ogopogo footage, the sightings she chronicled, the scientists she quoted, and the illustrations which adorn her book's covers seem to imply a belief that the monster of Okanagan Lake is a remnant plesiosaur, an ancient marine reptile with a long neck and tail, a wide body, and flippers, believed to have vanished from the Earth's estuaries and oceans in the mists of prehistory. Canadian zoologist Dale Alcigar, whom Gull quoted in her last book, summarized this theory in the following statement to the Kelowna Daily Courier. Ogopogo may be a remnant of the prehistoric plesiosaur, a large, smooth-skinned animal that lived in water. Zoologists believe something rather catastrophic happened to cause their extinction. It is possible that a few may have survived by retreating to holes in the deepest inland lakes. The idea that the Ogopogo might belong to some extant species of ancient reptile accords with the sentiments of Susan Allison, who mentioned, in her article in the September 15, 1934 issue of the Vancouver Province, that she personally believed the monster of Okanagan Lake was probably a big saurian, whose ancestor presumably survived whatever ancient cataclysmic event wiped out the remainder of its species. Another unusual idea, which contrasts with the popular portrait of the Ogopogo as a giant water snake, is the notion that the monster of Okanagan Lake is some sort of freshwater whale. This outlandish concept was championed by the late Dr. Roy McDougall, a University of Chicago biochemist with an interest in cryptozoology, the study of animals not recognized by science, and one of the first scientists to seriously investigate the mystery of the Loch Ness monster. In her book, In Search of Ogopogo, Arlene Gull related Dr. McDougall's theory that the Ogopogo was a member of some remnant family of Zeuglodon, an ancient genus of whale-like predators, more commonly known by the name Basilosaurus. This disturbing theory is bolstered by an eclectic assortment of evidence, from ancient native legends, to eyewitness accounts, to a startling osteological clue. Of the 2 pieces of first-hand Okanagan oral lore pertaining to the Ogopogo, which this author was able to unearth, one of them, namely Josephine Shuttleworth's story, How the Spider-Woman Was Rescued from the Fishman, identifies the monster of Okanagan Lake as a whale. The undeniable parallels between this story and Mourning Dove's tale leaves us in no doubt that the antagonist of Shuttleworth's story is indeed intended to be a member of the cetacean family, and not some sort of giant fish, whose nature was misinterpreted in the muddy mire of Okanagan English translation. In a bizarre affirmation of this strange Okanagan legend, an Okanagan chief named Manuel Louis, while swimming with his son and 5 friends at the northern end of neighboring Osoyoos Lake in the summer of 1923, claimed to have spotted what he believed to be a large whale rise to the surface of the water before submerging. Over the years, a startling number of eyewitnesses who claim to have seen the Ogopogo have remarked upon its resemblance to a whale. One sighting which illustrates the sentiment occurred one hot summer evening in mid-July 1967. That night, at around 6 or 7 o'clock, 3 teenagers from Kelowna, namely Brenda Brees, now Brenda DeRoos of Victoria, Brian Bocking, now deceased, and Brian's sister Candy, now Candy Van Hess of Kelowna, were out water skiing on Okanagan Lake. At the time of the sighting, the trio were motorboating within sight of Brenda's family's lakeside home in Casa Loma, a district of West Kelowna, on the western shores of the lake opposite Kelowna proper. Brenda was at the wheel, and Brian on the skis, when Brenda's attention was distracted by hundreds of tiny fish leaping out of the water. Author Mary Moon interviewed Brenda DeRoos in Vancouver and recorded her account of her experience in a 1977 book. "We were quite a distance from the shore," Brenda said, "about 1/3 of the way across the lake. I saw hundreds of little fish leaping up, the way they do in other places to catch flies at night. But they don't ordinarily jump like that in Okanagan Lake. Something was scaring those fish." Brenda looked for the cause of the unusual activity and spotted what she first took to be a large log floating in the water, up ahead of the boat and to the right. "It looked as I would imagine the back of a whale would look," she said. "Grayish, blubbery, and smooth with no humps. It was just lying there in the water, not moving, about 100 feet away from us. I saw 20 feet of it, a curved shape with no head and no fins, just like a whale resting under the surface of the water. I had to swerve the boat to the left to miss hitting it, and I glanced back to make sure I had missed it. Whatever it was had disappeared entirely. If it hadn't disappeared like that, I really would have thought it was a log. There were very few ripples." Terrified, Brenda drove the boat towards the Casa Loma dock, not daring to explain the cause of her unusual behavior until she and her friends were safely ashore. Candy, it turned out, had seen the creature as well, as had her mother, who had been watching the teenagers from her kitchen window, although Brian, on the water skis, had not. Incredibly, the notion of a pod of freshwater whales living in Okanagan Lake is allegedly supported by at least one tangible piece of evidence. According to the late Leonard Norris, the first president of the Okanagan Historical Society, in articles for the 1935 and 1953 reports of that institution, Captain Thomas Shorts, the lake's first freighter and ferryman, discovered a strange object in the lake in the mid-1880s. While heading towards the lake's eastern shore in his rowboat with an Indian passenger, roughly halfway between what are now the cities of Kelowna and Penticton, Captain Short stumbled upon what appeared to be the spine of some very large animal. He fished the object out of about 5 or 6 feet of water and brought it to his cabin. Some time later, he gave the bone to a local government agent, who proudly displayed it on the veranda outside his office in Vernon. By the time the Vernon government office moved into a new courthouse in November 1914, the bone had found its way into a neighboring woodshed, where it was employed as a block on which to split firewood. When it was found in the woodshed, Norris wrote, it appeared to be fast disintegrating. The surface crumbled to the touch when rubbed, and gave off a fine white powder, as if it had been thickly dusted with flour. The bone was transferred to the courthouse vault, where its deterioration slowed considerably. In this fragile state, it was examined by Frank Kermode, the aforementioned curator of Victoria's Royal British Columbia Museum, who identified it as part of the vertebra of a whale. Regrettably, sometime in the latter half of the 20th century, the bone mysteriously vanished from the courthouse and has not been relocated since. Every monster has its skeptics, and the Ogopogo is no exception. for as long as the Nataka has reared its sheep-like head from the waters of Okanagan Lake in the presence of human witnesses. Hard-headed rationalists have dismissed it as an optical illusion, produced by natural phenomena. One interesting variation of this theory appeared in the 6th report of the Okanagan Historical Society in 1935, in another article written by Leonard Norris. 3 years earlier, on February 4, 1932, steamboat captain Joseph B. Weeks noticed something peculiar in Okanagan Lake while making a routine trip from Kelowna to West Kelowna in his steamer, the Sicamous. About 7 miles southwest of what is now the Okanagan Lake Bridge, Captain Weeks saw an enormous column of water vapor rise out of the lake. The mysterious pillar maintained a height of about 150 feet for about 5 minutes before sinking back into the water. Captain Weeks described the experience to a visiting mining engineer and geologist named J. Rickert, who had cut his professional teeth in the late booming oil fields of Turner Valley, Alberta. In a letter to the Okanagan Historical Society, written on July 2, 1934, Rickert expressed his opinion that Weeks' strange vapor column was probably caused by an outburst of underground gas, which escaped through a fissure in the earth. This fissure, he surmised, developed as the result of a pressure change in a subterranean oil and gas reserve beneath the lake, precipitated by a nearby drilling operation conducted by the Okanagan Oil and Gas Company. In a commentary on Rickert's statement, Norris wrote, "This outburst of gas may also prove that another Indian tradition is based on fact. There is, and has always been, since the white men first came to live on the lake, a fixed and settled belief among the Indians that there is something extraordinary in the lake. How often a similar outburst has occurred, we do not know, but it may have happened before, and these jets of gas and vapor thrown into the air may be the basis on which the Indian belief or tradition rests." Freak underground gas leaks, of course, are not the only natural phenomena on which Ogopogo sightings have been blamed. Today, in Canadian media coverage of the handful of Ogopogo sightings which inevitably occur each summer, scientists of various disciplines can be reliably called upon to diagnose footage, photos, and eyewitness descriptions of Okanagan Lake's most famous resident, as depictions of swimming moose, swimming beavers, ducks swimming in a line, or complementary waves, misinterpreted by overactive imaginations influenced by the power of suggestion. Since the days of John P. Babcock, government officials, scientists, and armchair ichthyologists have proposed that the monster in Okanagan Lake is really a giant sturgeon, an enormous bottom-feeding fish found in lakes and rivers throughout Western Canada, some of which are known to have lived for as long as a century. The lower estimates of Ogopogo's length, they argue, accord perfectly with the dimensions of very old and very large members of this Piscine species. To their mind, classic descriptions of the Ogopogo as a large scaled animal with dorsal fins, floating atop the water like an animated log, are clear indications that the lake's legendary inhabitant is an unusually large specimen of that rare and ancient fish. One of the first articles to articulate this theory appeared in the August 16, 1925 issue of the Vancouver Province, which had this to say of the demon seen by both whites and Indians in Okanagan Lake. There is every possibility that such a monster does exist in the lake. They assert that all the descriptions of those who claim to have seen it would indicate that it is a giant sturgeon. Sturgeons grow to immense size in British Columbia waters and attain a tremendous age. Recently, one was caught near Bonington Falls that weighed 700 pounds. Another was taken from the waters of Stewart Lake a few days ago, which weighed 300 pounds, while one caught in the Fraser some time ago scaled more than 900 pounds and was 13 feet long. Many witnesses who claim to have seen the Ogopogo have vehemently refuted the sturgeon theory, and with good reason. While some ancient sturgeons do occasionally reach a length of 20 feet, the largest ever recorded being a 23-foot 7-inch long monster hauled from Russia's Volga River in 1827, the vast majority of Canadian specimens seldom exceed 12 feet in length. Even supposing that the augmentative effects of fear and imagination could account for the tremendous 20 to 50 foot dimensions that Ogopogo witnesses consistently bestowed upon the subject of their sightings, or supposing that we entertain the notion that the hypothetic sturgeon of Okanagan Lake is the largest of its kind to ever grace the waters of Western Canada, The white sturgeon of British Columbia are typically pale gray in color. The Ogopogo, by contrast, is consistently described as very dark or black. The behavior attributed to the Ogopogo is also at odds with the known habits of white sturgeon. Like all fish, sturgeon swim by lateral undulation. The Ogopogo, in comparison, is said to either vertically undulate or to swim smoothly through the water without visibly oscillating its body. The Ogopogo's propensity to visit the lake's surface on hot summer afternoons is another of its customs, which conflicts with typical sturgeon behavior. As Arlene Gall put it in her book In Search of Ogopogo, considering the great depth of Okanagan Lake and the fact that sturgeon are bottom feeders, if they do indeed inhabit the lake, they would rarely, if ever, need to come up to the surface. Ogopogo, on the other hand, not only breaks the water, but enjoys swimming at high speeds through the lake with head held high. Sturgeon, as we know, remain underwater while swimming, and do not have the classic neck of the Ogopogo. Perhaps the most damning nail in the coffin of the sturgeon theory is the fact that, despite Okanagan Lakes being a favorite fishing destination for anglers across the country, not one of these massive fish has ever been reeled out of its waters. According to Arlene Gall, in the 1980s, a Kelowna-based sporting goods store called Harv's Outdoor Sports teamed up with the local CKIQ radio station to offer a $10,000 prize to any fisherman who could catch Okanagan Lake's legendary sturgeon. The prize was never claimed, and to this day, not a single sturgeon has ever been caught in Okanagan Lake. Since at least 1926, theorists have proposed that the Ogopogo is some sort of freshwater oarfish, which abandoned the Pacific Ocean for the more placid waters of the British Columbian interior. The regular saltwater variety being a long, ribbon-like sea creature, with a dorsal fin which runs down the length of its back. These rare, mysterious eel-like animals, which have been blamed for many sea-serpent sightings on the high seas, can reach a length of at least 26 feet, but more typically measure about 10 feet from nose to tail. One variety of oarfish, the giant oarfish, which hails from the Pacific Ocean, sports a crown-like appendage, evoking the horns described by many Ogopogo witnesses. One article advocating the Oarfish Theory appeared in the December 28, 1926 issue of the Calgary Herald, remarking that the oarfish has a pronounced sheep-like head with a small mouth and imperfectly developed teeth. Written descriptions and photographs of the oarfish coincide exactly with stories which occasional but frequent glimpses of the Okanagan Ogopogo, with its sheep-like head and sea-serpentish attributes, have furnished. One problem with the Oarfish Theory, aside from the obvious issue that oarfish are marine animals adapted to saltwater environments, is that all known varieties of oarfish are light-colored, their skin covered by a silvery bluish tissue, which, like that of the sturgeon, contrasts sharply with the swarthy epidermis of the Ogopogo. One of the first, and arguably most chilling theories regarding the identity of the monster of Okanagan Lake is that the creature is some sort of large predatory amphibian, which not only haunts the water, but also makes occasional forays onto the lake's shore, or atop the rocks of Rattlesnake Island to feed. Among the first writers to put this idea to paper was Susan Allison, who, in her articles and memoirs, reiterated that her Okanagan Indian friends seemed to regard the creature as some sort of giant amphibious monster, with the ability to conjure powerful winds. Of Rattlesnake Island, the creature's supposed terrestrial haunt, she wrote the following in an unpublished handwritten manuscript, now housed in the Royal British Columbia Museum in Victoria, BC. Insignificant and barren, although picturesque, this islet would fail to attract the attention of an ordinary observer, but for the Aborigines, it possesses a horrible fascination. It is, or was formerly thought to be, the home of the monster of the Okanagan Lake, and while eyeing it with dread interest, none of the natives ever dared to approach or attempt to land there. The Indians aver that in passing this islet, they have frequently seen the blood, bones, and fat of the victims smeared on the rocky shore. It is impossible to ascertain the exact nature of this monster, but it is amphibious. The Indians evidently think it partakes in the nature of the Sani Apu, a species of devil, sometimes benevolent, sometimes malevolent, in this case always malevolent. in another of her pieces, namely an ethnological treatise on the Indians of the Similkameen River, published in the 1892 issue of the Journal of the Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland, Allison explained that the Sani-Apu was a sort of preternatural monster, set to haunt Okanagan country and the Similkameen Valley, which had the body of a man, the head of a deer, and the wings of a bat. The natives, Allison contended, were not the only residents of Okanagan Lake who had reason to believe their neighborhood monster had the ability to both swim and crawl. In her aforementioned 1926 letter to the Vancouver Sunday Province, she claimed that she knew white pioneers who heard the sound of a large animal moving through a swampy lakeside meadow one night, which apparently disappeared into the lake by the time they emerged from their cabin to investigate. The tragic tale of Chief Timbasket, which first appeared in the writings of Frank Morgan Buckland, affirms the native perception of the Ogopogo as a creature of both the land and the water. Recall that in the version of the story which he wrote in about 1927, Buckland claimed that the remains of Timbasket's canoe were discovered at what was probably Baker Lake, a small body of water located about 4.5 miles east of Rattlesnake Island. Buckland concluded that story with the rhetorical question of whether the lake demon could have possibly dragged Timbasket and his family to the area before devouring them. One final piece of evidence supporting the idea that the natives of Okanagan Lake indeed perceive the Ogopogo as a monstrous amphibian is the pictograph which is said to have once adorned a granite shelf overlooking McKinley Landing north of Kelowna, which Primrose Upton interpreted as a long-tailed creature with a humped back, horns, and the head of a horse, which appeared to be sneaking through the cattails like a colossal rodent. Over the years, lakeside residents have recovered several tantalizing bits of physical evidence, hinting that the Ogopogo may occasionally leave its watery abode to walk upon the shores of Okanagan Lake. At about 7:30 a.m., on the morning of July 22, 1949, the young son of a motel owner named Howard Faulkner found 6 mysterious circular footprints, about 8 inches in diameter, on a beach south of Kelowna. These tracks, each of which bore between 5 to 8 toes, depending on the journalist who covered the story, appeared to have been made by a heavy animal, which crawled out of the water and strolled down the beach for some time, before retreating back into the depths. Over a decade later, on April 28, 1960, mysterious tracks measuring 18 inches in length, 12 inches in width, and 6 inches in depth were discovered in shallow water near Okanagan Landing. Newspapers described these prints, which were purportedly irregular in shape, as big enough for an elephant. Perhaps the oldest and eeriest discovery evoking the Amphibian Theory was a find made in late June 1914. While on their way to a rodeo in Penticton, a group of Indians from the West Bank Reserve in West Kelowna are said to have come across the badly decomposed remains of a mysterious animal on the shores of Okanagan Lake opposite Rattlesnake Island. The 6-foot-long, 600-pound carcass was unlike anything they had ever seen before, and many of the witnesses concluded that it must belong to the lake demon, of which their people had long spoken. In one of his articles, Frank Buckland described the creature as having a short, broad, flat tail, and a head that stuck out between shoulders, without any sign of a neck. The nose was stubby, sticking out of a rounded head, with no ears visible. The thick hide was sparsely covered with a silky hair, 4 or 5 inches in length, and of a bluish-gray color, while the teeth resembled those of a dog. It had 2 ivory-like tusks, and claws resembling those of a great bird, on flipper-like arms, claws that showed no signs of wear or use, such as those of a cougar or other land animal. Whatever its true nature, sightings of the monster continue to be made every year, particularly on hot, tranquil afternoons, when Okanagan Lake reflects the mountains that fringe it like a giant mirror. If you ever find yourself in Okanagan country, consider paying a visit to Squally Point, Rattlesnake Island, or Allison Provincial Park, the traditional haunts of the Inha-ha-itk. If you're lucky, you might catch a glimpse of one of Canada's most famous lake monsters, the Ogopogo of Okanagan Lake.